Chapter 139, End of the School Year. For example, if he integrated the soothing 48 of a calming flower into fiendfire, would it blunt its violent nature? Or, conversely, could adding the 48 of some volatile plant amplify its power? Regulus ran through the magical plants he had studied: calming flowers for calm and sedation, bubotubers for skin irritation, venomous tentaculae for corrosion and paralysis, moonlight orchids for dispelling darkness, sunlight ebony shrubs for purifying evil. Each plant carried its own magical property. If those properties could be integrated into fiendfire, add the properties of a calming flower and the fiendfire might become docile and easier to control. Add venomous tentacula traits and the flames might gain a corrosive effect, burning through not just matter, but perhaps 48 itself. Infuse sunlight ebony shrub imagery and fiendfire could take on a purifying light. What if he added 44? If he burned someone with fiendfire laced with that property, would it heal instead of harm? The Homping Willow's force might make the fiendfire more aggressive, but how to fuse them? Natural 48 and fiendfire were fundamentally opposed. Forcing a fusion could trigger an immediate explosion. He needed a balance point or some medium as a bridge. Then he thought of starry sky imagery. Starry sky imagery could strengthen ordinary spells. Picturing a calm vastness made a shield charm more solid. Envisioning concentrated destruction amplified a confringo. Was there any starry sky imagery suitable for binding fiendfire? Stars came to mind. Stars burn, but their combustion is steady and ordered. Vast mass generates gravity, which confines the violent fusion reactions and lets energy escape steadily as light and heat. That idea, gravitational confinement, might be useful as a mental image. Of course, it was only imagery. He couldn't reproduce stellar gravity. He didn't know whether 48 could mimic it, and he certainly couldn't. Still, he could borrow the concept of confinement and stability to build a mental frame for controlling fiendfire. He decided to try. He summoned the fiendfire again and shaped it into a bird. While maintaining the shape, he projected the imagery of stellar confinement, a blazing core wrapped in an invisible gravitational field, flames violent but constrained, burning steadily within a fixed radius. The fiendfire bird shuddered. The flames began to jitter at the edges. Wings lengthened, then snapped back. Sparks burst from its tail. The form started to change, not finer, but more ordered, as if some force compressed the flames inward, condensing the shape. Immediately after, however, instability flared. The confinement imagery clashed with fiendfire's instinct to expand. The core temperature spiked. The color shifted from orange-red to brilliant white. The air in the 28 began to warp. Regulus felt his control slipping. The fiendfire threatened to break free. He cut it out at once. The stellar confinement imagery was useful, but he had misapplied it or used too much intensity. Fiendfire was a cursed fire, not stellar fusion. Pressing concepts from astrophysics onto it could backfire. Still, it pointed a way forward, using starry sky imagery to assist control rather than relying only on brute will. If he ever needed fiendfire to incinerate absolutely everything, he could switch to imagery of a supernova, the terminal blast of a star, an eruption of ultimate destruction, or a black hole, a consuming gravity well. Those images couldn't recreate celestial phenomena, but they might steer fiendfire toward more extreme, thorough combustion. Not yet, though. With only 4.5 stars lit in his star orbit meditation, his mental strength and control weren't sufficient to sustain that level of imagery projection. When he'd lit all 7 stars and matured the system, perhaps then. At that point, fiendfire as a curse could be called truly formidable. He was still far from the control shown by Dumbledore or Lord Voldemort, but he had a direction and time. If he couldn't achieve it now, he would keep practicing. He also wanted to try sending fiendfire through a spatial portal, teleport a fiendfire bird behind an enemy for a lethal surprise. On second thought, he abandoned the idea. Fiendfire had its own will. If, while crossing a portal, it decided, "This portal looks like fuel, I'll burn it too," and tried to cut through the fabric of space, there was no predicting the outcome. It might reach the intended place, get stuck in a spatial rift, or trigger a collapse. The risk was too great. He couldn't try it yet. At 2 in the morning, Regulus left the room of requirement and walked back to his dormitory. The corridors were silent, save for his footsteps against the stone. Moonlight pooled through the stained glass windows, painting mottled patterns on the floor. Exam week was nearly over, and the holidays were coming. He had plans to make. Arnold Belmont did not return to Hogwarts until after the exams. His absence stirred some talk in Slytherin, mainly a few cold jokes among the older students. The Belmont family business probably couldn't buy a break like that. Maybe they were moving to Bulgaria. The other houses barely cared. There was always fresh scandal at Hogwarts, like the Thorne family attack. It had been talked about and then dropped. Orion hadn't written to explain the details. To the head of the House of Black, it was the sort of thing one handled and forgot. Regulus heard the rest from Narcissa. The Belmonts had surrendered their properties and smuggling channels in Britain and moved east with the family's remaining galleons. Which country specifically wasn't mentioned. The House of Black didn't touch their money. First, it would have looked greedy. Second, how much of that fortune they could keep abroad would be up to the Belmonts. Fighting for scraps, Narcissa had said, her mouth twisting. Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, the xenophobia over there is no kinder than in Britain. If the Belmonts want a foothold, they'll pay half their galleons in tolls. The rest is up to fate. Regulus only nodded. It was no longer his concern. When the exams ended and results posted, the notice board in the Great Hall drew a crowd. He didn't join them. He already knew his results. Avery shoved his way in, returned with a flat expression, and announced, "Straight O's, you got all O's." Regulus replied with a casual and kept packing. Tomorrow the holidays began. Tonight was the end-of-term feast. The young 46 had gone wild, the tension of exams finally released, people running in the corridors. In the common room, someone was using levitation charms to toss pillows. On the grass by the Black Lake, a few Hufflepuffs picnicked, their laughter drifting across the grounds. Avery dragged Alex and Hermes down to the lake and asked Regulus to come. He declined, gathered a few overdue books, and headed to the library. At a time like this, the library was nearly empty. Even the most studious Ravenclaws were relaxing. Madame Pince dozed behind the desk, head nodding occasionally. Regulus took his usual seat by the window. He'd been there 10 minutes when he heard footsteps and looked up. Lily Evans stood at the table. She wasn't in robes tonight, but a light blue dress. Her red hair was tied back in a ponytail, which made her look refreshed. "It's rare to see anyone in the 32 at this hour," she said lightly. "You're here too." Regulus nodded. Lily sat opposite him and set an advanced potions textbook on the table, but didn't open it. Instead, she asked the question she'd been holding for almost a month. "Regulus, can you tell me why you treated that person that way?" He understood she meant Arnold Belmont. When he'd run into Lily and Snape in the 32 before, he'd seen the curiosity in her eyes. She had held it in for weeks and finally asked. He didn't answer directly. Instead, in a gentler voice than usual, he asked back, "Then why do you think I did it?" Lily blinked, took in his expression, and unexpectedly laughed. She didn't know why she wanted to laugh. Perhaps she was remembering how seriously Regulus had once lectured her on friendship being a mutual choice. Now, hearing that same measured tone, the seriousness of it struck her as suddenly amusing. Chapter 140, Sirius Returns Home. "I know you had a reason for doing that," Lily said, her smile fading into something more serious. "You're not the sort to pick on people for no reason, but I didn't understand it at first. I don't get the whole hierarchy and the rules of pureblood families," she went on. "Britain has aristocrats, titles, and traditions like dueling for honor. It all seems so far removed from ordinary life. To me, it's like plots from novels and movies, things that don't really happen." She watched Regulus as she said the word movie and noticed no confusion on his face. He stayed gentle. There was even a hint of encouragement in his eyes. "I thought about it a long time," Lily continued, "and I came to see that you were defending your family's honor, or dignity. Your methods were a bit extreme, but..." She trailed off, as if the whole concept still felt foreign. "Anyway," she added, looking straight at him, "you're my friend, and I support you. I've come to accept there are reasons for what you did. I might not fully understand them, but I don't think you were wrong." Regulus listened quietly. He didn't argue. Relief flickered across his face for the briefest instant, which Lily caught. She gave him a teasing, annoyed look. "What's that?" Like a teacher watching a student finally get the answer right? He didn't take the bait. He simply nodded. You're right. That's exactly it. They sat with each other for a few seconds, then Lily looked away first and smiled. They returned to their books. The library was hushed, except for the occasional snore from Madame Pince and the rustle of turning pages. Sunlight slanted through the high windows, making bands of light across the long oak table where dust motes danced. As dinner time approached, they closed their books and stood. Have a good holiday, Regulus said. See you next term. Lily answered. She paused at the door and added, Write to me if your family owl can find my house. It can, Regulus replied. Lily smiled and left. At the end of term feast, the great hall was decorated in Slytherin silver and green. The enchanted ceiling showed a summer night, candles floated in the air, and long tables grown under roast turkey, steak and kidney pie, Yorkshire pudding, treacle tart, pumpkin juice and butterbeer. Dumbledore stood and tapped his glass. Another school year has come to an end, he said, clear and ringing. First, the House Cup points. There was no suspense. Slytherin took first, Ravenclaw second, Gryffindor third, Hufflepuff fourth. Reserved applause rippled along the Slytherin table. At Gryffindor, some students glared at James and Sirius. They'd been chiefly responsible for the 50 points lost through their fighting. James and Sirius paid it no mind. They stood, cheering and banging their plates, drawing a sharp look from Professor McGonagall before they settled, still grinning. Dumbledore turned to the 7th years in their new robes. Hogwarts will always be your school, he said. The world outside is more complicated than the castle, and choices are harder than classroom exercises. But remember this, power is not just power, it is responsibility. His blue eyes swept the hall behind his half-moon spectacles. Do what is right, he said, not what is easy. Sometimes they are the same, and sometimes they are not. In those moments, you will have to judge for yourselves. The 7th years shifted. Some looked down, some gripped their goblets, some exchanged looks. Dumbledore raised his glass. I wish you all a happy holiday. See you in September. After the feast, the Slytherin table buzzed. Avery speaking of a family manor in France, Alex whispering of a trip to a magical zoo in Germany. Hermes said little, but his eyes lingered on Regulus. Regulus waited for the hall to clear, then rose and crossed to the Gryffindor table. James saw him first. His smiling face tightened, and he leaned forward like a hound about to spring. Regulus stopped 2 steps away, his gaze skimming past James and fixing on Sirius. Father wants you to come home, he said. The words were for Sirius, but James shot up anyway. Home? He barked. What for? Back to that hellhole? Sirius isn't happy there at all. Sirius cut him off by pressing a hand down hard on James's shoulder. James, he said quietly. James's breath came fast, but he fell silent. Regulus had never once looked at James. His eyes never left Sirius. Sirius looked down at his own shoes. He had received Orion Black's letter the day before, an owl delivering a single sentence, "Come home for the holidays." If it had been a letter from his mother, Walburga, he might have burned it. Her letters were always the same, pure-blood glory, family duty, how he should have been sorted into Slytherin, whom he should associate with. He hated those words. But his father was different. Orion hardly ever bothered with him. When he did, it was in a quiet, serious way. He spent most of his time in his study or managing family business. He didn't scream or insult like Walburga. He simply looked at you with those deep, gray eyes, and the silence that came with that look carried more pressure than any shout. Sirius had wanted to rebel against his father, but he lacked the confidence. Orion never forced him into anything, never made him learn the family tree or attend endless pure-blood gatherings. Yet by being there, by being Orion, he exerted a mountain-like pressure, silent, immense, impossible to ignore. Sirius had thought about pretending he never got the letter. An owl could have been lost, the letter eaten, anything. But with Regulus standing in the hall, delivering the message in person, denial was impossible. He met Regulus's calm eyes for a moment, then looked away. Understood, he said dryly. Regulus nodded and turned away. James watched Regulus's back, fists clenched. Lupin murmured, "Forget it, James. That's his family business." "Family business?" James scoffed. "I'd rather not go near a place like that." It was well known in pure-blood circles that Sirius Black, the eldest son of House Black, spent holidays at the Potters rather than at his own house. That alone was a signal. Orion asking him to return wasn't just a father-to-son summons, it involved the House of Black's reputation. If Sirius missed 2 long holidays in a row, other families might think House Black couldn't control its heir, that there were problems inside. Pureblood society cared deeply about appearances. No matter the private turmoil, a family had to present a united front. Sirius understood that and hated it. Still, he didn't dare test that line, at least not yet. Orion's patience had limits. Pushed too far and the consequences could be severe, cut off from family funds, pressure on the Potters, or even disownment. Disownment. The idea made his heart stutter. Would being disowned mean freedom? The thought flickered before he stifled it. He knew the fallout, loss of protection, hardship in the wizarding world, and the risk of dragging James and the Potters into trouble for sheltering him. He couldn't be that selfish, so he would go home, only for a few days, he promised himself. Appear for the holidays, keep the peace, and then slip away again. The feast wound down. Students flowed back to their common rooms to finish packing. Sirius followed the Gryffindor crowd toward the tower. James walked beside him, several times opening his mouth and then clamping it shut. At last, he only clapped Sirius on the shoulder. "Right if anything happens," he said. "I'll keep my family owl on standby." Sirius nodded and forced a smile. Chapter 141. Let the two of you fight. The Hogwarts Express shrieked to a stop at King's Cross, steam curling out and cloaking the platform in white mist. Students poured from the carriages while parents on the far side waved, called names, and embraced their children. Regulus and Sirius walked side by side, immediately noticeable. One wore 22-23 robes with a House of Black crest brooch pinned at his collar, his pace steady and his expression composed. The other wore muggle jeans and a plaid shirt, hair ruffled, impatience written across his face. They were similar in height and bone structure, high bridges to their noses, deep-set eyes, thin lips, but temperament separated them completely. Regulus was reserved and sharp. Sirius was all heat and quick fuse, ready to burn anyone in his path. A few younger girls stole glances and whispered. Among the parents, pure-blood families recognized the Black brothers. Even those who did not, Muggle-borns, could tell they were handsome, despite the sourness on one of their faces. They moved to a quieter corner of the platform, where Kreacher was waiting. The house elf wore a tea towel stamped with the House of Black crest and bowed so low his nose nearly touched the ground. "Young masters are home," he croaked respectfully. "Kreacher has come to bring young masters back." He extended 2 gnarled hands and touched Sirius's and Regulus's arms in turn. Sirius stiffened. He disliked house elves' hands on him, disliked Kreacher in particular. The space shimmered. The platform blurred into colors, then resolved into the familiar entrance hall of 12 Grimmauld Place. Portraits of past Blacks lined the walls. Several had already roused and watched them as they came in. "Ah! The rebel returns," Phineas Nigellus sniffed, stroking his goatee with that infuriatingly superior tone. Dressed in Muggle rags, quite the disgrace to the House of Black. Sirius ignored him, shrugged off Kreacher's touch, and strode inside. Walburga rushed from the sitting room and stopped short when she saw Regulus. A radiant smile unfurled across her face. "Regulus," she crowed, throwing her arms wide. "Well done. I heard, that impertinent boy from the House of Belmont. You taught him a lesson, showed them the House of Black will not be trifled with. Defending the family's honor. That is my son." Her voice ran on, sharp and excited, echoing in the hall. After a minute of praise, she seemed to notice Sirius. The smile evaporated, and the corners of her mouth hardened. "You're back too," she said, cool and distant, as if addressing an unwelcome guest. Sirius let the corner of his mouth twitch but said nothing. Orion acknowledged them both with a single flat nod. Regulus, Sirius. "Let's eat," he added, and led the way into the dining room. The long table was set with a dark green cloth, silverware polished to a shine. House elves brought course after course: roast lamb chops with mint sauce, creamy mushroom soup, asparagus salad, glazed plum pudding. Walburga sat to the left of the head and chattered at Regulus the whole time. Exam results, Slytherin politics, his plans for the coming term. Regulus answered briefly, every sentence pleasing her, until she beamed like a cat that had caught a canary. Sirius sat beside Regulus as if he were invisible. No one served him, no one asked after him, even the house elf skirted around him while carrying platters. He looked down at the cold mushroom soup in his bowl and thought of the pile of chocolate frogs and cauldron cakes he'd eaten on the train. His stomach flipped. He spooned mashed potatoes mechanically, watching the pattern on the tablecloth. Regulus cut his lamb chop slowly, temperate, replying to his mother in measured tones. Sirius watched him, a hot, indefinable anger knotting inside. Why could Regulus be so calm? Why could he endure this? Why had he chosen to become what they wanted? He knew it was unfair. Regulus had his reasons, made his choices, even if Sirius couldn't understand or accept them. But surrounded by Walburga's shrill laughter and the portrait's haughty gazes, he felt rage bubbling up. He wanted to fling the table, smash things, shout at them all. Instead, he kept his head down and spooned. Dinner ended. Orion folded his napkin. "Regulus," he said, "rest for a while, then go to the 18. He looked at Sirius. "You go too." Sirius froze, spoon midair, then gave a curt nod. "Fine." He stood and went up to his room. Everything was as it always had been. Fresh sheets smelling faintly of sunlight, the childhood books on the shelf, Quidditch through the ages, travels with trolls, fascinating history of magic. The desk by the window remembered him, where he used to lie to do homework, and where Walburga used to scold that his handwriting looked like a spider's trail. The house elf kept the room immaculate. There was barely a speck of dust. It felt like a display for the eldest son of the House of Black, not a home for him. He was Sirius Black, and he did not want to be the heir they imagined. He sat on the edge of the bed, hands on his knees, staring at the floor. How was he supposed to face Regulus? His brother had chosen a path Sirius despised, and yet Regulus was succeeding by every measure Sirius loathed. Straight O's, a first-year prefect in Slytherin, handling even a seventh year like Arnold Belmont with ease. Regulus was flourishing among the purebloods, becoming the kind of son an old house like the Blacks admired. How was he supposed to face Orion? His father never scolded, rarely struck, and hardly spoke. That silent, oppressive judgment felt worse than Walburga's shrieks. Orion behaved as if Sirius ought to accept the family's training and become a proper heir. When Sirius rebelled, Orion neither encouraged nor intervened. He simply watched, as if Sirius were a stranger. At Hogwarts, James and the others, Sirius could forget for a while. He could laugh, pull pranks, and tell himself to hell with the House of Black. But back at Grimmauld Place, the pressure returned. Half an hour later, there was a knock. Sirius opened the door to find Regulus standing there in training gear. 22 tight-fitting top and dark gray trousers, no robes. "Let's go," Regulus said, nodding. Calm. To the 18. Sirius followed him downstairs in a numb daze. They reached Orion's study, where an ordinary-looking black portrait hung at the far end of the room. As they approached, the portrait slid aside, revealing a stone door that opened slowly. Orion stood waiting beyond it, dressed for activity in plain, dark gray clothing of obvious quality. He turned as they entered, his eyes resting first on Regulus. The boy had grown again over the holidays. Sharper features, calmer eyes. He already looked less like a teenager and more composed, measured. Very good. Orion's gaze shifted to Sirius. He had not seen his eldest son for nearly a year, and the changes were plain. Taller, broader-shouldered, the last of his childish softness hardened into a stubborn defiance. Muggle clothes only emphasized the contrast with the family's ancient traditions. Sirius lowered his eyes at his father's glance, but then lifted them again, stubbornly seeking some reaction. Anger, disgust, disappointment, anything. There was nothing but indifference. Relief and disappointment warred in him. He looked away. The brothers could have been twins. The same 22 hair, the same gray eyes, the same high-bridged noses and thin lips. Temperament set them apart. Orion suppressed whatever stirred inside him. Regret, disappointment, something else, and spoke plainly. Regulus, Sirius. They both looked up at once. "You two spar first," he said. "Let me see how much you have both improved this year." Chapter 142, Overwork. Sirius stood to the left, his wand gripped in his hand, a bewildered look on his face. He had been summoned at this hour last year as well. It was just after returning home for the holidays, and likewise to test his progress in magic. Back then, Orion had stepped in personally, and Sirius had been beaten senseless, left on the floor unable to get up for a long time, while his father returned to the study and left him alone. This year was different. Orion had told him to spar with Regulus. He still couldn't make sense of it. Spar with Regulus? He knew the stories about what Regulus had done at Hogwarts, fighting fifth years as a first year, going up against seventh years in the second term, being treated like a treasure by the teachers, and constantly pulled aside for extra lessons. But those were only hearsay. He'd never actually seen Regulus fight, except for that brief, blurry incident on the Hogwarts Express at the start of last year. James's spell had solidified and fallen apart so fast, Sirius hadn't seen the whole thing. Later, James had said he was going to pick a fight with Regulus, but when he returned, his face had gone cold. Remus's retelling sounded like the usual shenanigans of young wizards. It hadn't made an impression. A thought flickered through Sirius's mind. Regulus should be able to beat me easily now, right? It annoyed him. He acknowledged Regulus's talent. This younger brother had been different since childhood. Casting magic at age 3, reversing transfiguration at 5, already outclassing older students before even arriving at school. He knew how much Regulus sacrificed for power. Hours in the study, practicing in the attic until late. And yet Sirius was a Black as well. He might dislike the name, might even resent it, but there were no unremarkable bloods in this family. He was a year and a half older than Regulus, had an extra year of schooling, and was one of the Marauders. Everyone at Hogwarts knew them, prowling the corridors at night, pulling pranks, fighting with Slytherin. He had never shied from a fight. What was he lacking? He wanted to try. He wanted to see how wide the gap truly was and what Regulus was striving for. He swallowed his doubts and said one word, "Fine." He looked at Regulus, but Regulus wasn't looking at him. His gaze was fixed on Orion's face, asking without words, "Are you serious?" Orion met his son's eyes and nodded barely. Regulus understood. Their father intended to give Sirius a lesson, to make him taste the value of strength, to kindle in him the desire to be stronger, even if that desire sprang from the simplest impulse, the need to hit back when hurt. Regulus thought that necessary. Sirius had talent. Becoming an animagus showed that, but that alone wasn't enough. Animagus work is an advanced application of transfiguration, demanding exceptional magical control, patience, will, and luck. Only 7 registered animagi existed in 20th century Britain. Sirius's success proved he had talent. What he lacked was the inner drive. Sirius had learned magic for fun, for pranks, to go on adventures with friends. He had become an animagus out of loyalty to his mates, to help Lupin on full moons, not because he craved power itself. That sort of motivation allowed one to master particular tricks, but it rarely pushed someone to improve their strength systematically and continuously. Regulus was different. He had long since planned his path, a path that required power as foundation and strength as guarantee, to deal with the threat of Voldemort, to protect the family, to survive future conflicts, to reach for higher things. Every goal demanded more strength. Regulus wanted to awaken in Sirius a subjective pursuit of magic. It didn't have to be grand. Even wanting to protect friends, to have the ability to fight back, or not to be a burden to others, any of those would do. But Sirius couldn't see the undercurrents beneath calm waters. In the original story, Sirius eventually died at the Ministry of Magic, killed as an accidental consequence of battle and of stepping into danger to protect Harry. It wasn't a noble sacrifice, so much as a tragic mishap. If he'd had greater power, better tactical sense, more caution, the outcome might have been different. Regulus did not want that ending for his brother. Even if Sirius chose a different path from their family, even if he stood against them, Regulus hoped he would at least be strong enough to survive. So he planned to give him a beating, to make him taste the bitterness of power and see whether it would spark something. Regulus looked at Sirius without speaking, then walked to a corner of the training ground and stopped 10 feet from the wall, turning to face him. Sirius walked to the opposite corner. They bowed, wands across their chests, and inclined their heads slightly. Orion called from the side, "Begin." Orion stepped back to the wall, leaned against it with his arms folded, watching the 2 boys on the field and nursing a 1 in 10,000 hope in his chest. What if? What if Sirius, too, had some hidden talent like Regulus and simply hadn't shown it yet. He had allowed himself that thought once in private with Regulus and never mentioned it again. Asking again would make him appear capricious and unsettled. Still, he couldn't help thinking, what if, on the field, Regulus did not raise his wand or adopt a combat stance? He held his wand in his right hand, letting it hang by his side, his body loose as if taking a leisurely walk. He stepped forward. His pace wasn't fast, 1 step, 2 steps, his footsteps light and nearly silent. Sirius assumed a proper dueling posture, left foot forward, right foot back, weight lowered, wand leveled with his shoulder, tip aimed at Regulus. Seeing that Regulus showed no intention of attacking first, hadn't even raised his wand, Sirius felt insulted. Anger flared. Stupefy! A jet of red light shot from his wand and flew straight toward Regulus's chest. Regulus neither dodged nor blocked. The red beam struck the air an inch before him, exploded into sparks, and died away. A faint silver shimmer flashed across his torso, rippling like waves for a mere split second before vanishing, the brief sign of a constant shield charm taking an impact. The protection was so strong, or the attack so weak, that the ripple was almost invisible. Sirius gritted his teeth and kept firing. Jinx spell, Expelliarmus, Incendio, Defindo, Repelling Charm. 5 spells, each a different color and trajectory, converged on Regulus from different angles. Regulus's footsteps remained unchanged as he walked forward. The red, blue, and orange lights struck him like raindrops on glass, fizzing into sparks and fading. Occasionally, a tiny glimmer raced across his body, but not once did his clothes stir. Sirius flushed with humiliation. He'd never seen dueling like this. The opponent didn't lift his wand, relied on some unknown defensive magic, and simply advanced, as if the attacks were no more than bothersome flies. Anger, shame, disbelief? Has Regulus reached this level? Sirius even suspiciously lifted his wand to make sure it wasn't a fake. Had creature switched it to make Regulus look better and humiliate him? He shook off the absurd thought and continued, resolving to use something stronger. Confringo. The blast hit in front of Regulus, detonating in flame and shock. Regulus stood at the center of the explosion, and not a hair on his head moved. Reducto. A more powerful blast distorted the air half a meter ahead, a visible shockwave rippling outward. The result was the same. Regulus kept walking. Cutting Curse. A silver arc of light sliced through the air toward Regulus's neck. It struck the barrier with a shriek of friction, then dissolved into pinpricks of light. By this time, Regulus had closed to within 3 paces of Sirius. He had gauged Sirius's level, perhaps an excellent 2nd or 3rd year at Hogwarts, not the very top. And Sirius was just standing there casting, with no movement or footwork. Talent squandered like that was almost criminal. Regulus would not give him any more chances. His pace quickened, covering the last 3 meters in 2 strides, and he stood directly in front of Sirius. Sirius's face was flushed with anger and shame. His hand gripping the wand trembled, his glare razor-sharp. Regulus met those gray eyes like his own, but now they burned with a quiet, fierce unwillingness, asking without words, "How dare you treat me like this?" Regulus's face was impassive, calm, detached, as if he were examining an object. "Is that it?" he said flatly. Sirius's breath hitched. They were so close that he couldn't raise his wand again. He wanted to spit out curses, to tell Regulus he had no right to look down on people, but the words stuck. He could not force them out. Regulus didn't intend to use magic. He slid his left hand under Sirius's right arm, placed his palm against the ribs beneath Sirius's right side, and applied pressure. Chapter 143, Another Showdown. Sirius let out a muffled groan as his body doubled over like a shrimp. A sharp pain erupted beneath his right ribs, as if a red-hot iron rod had been driven in and twisted. His vision dimmed, his legs buckled, and his 28 slipped from his hand, clattering onto the stone floor. He clutched the wounded spot with both hands and gasped, but the pain made his respiratory muscles spasm, and he could barely draw a full breath. Regulus withdrew his hand and took a half-step back. Sirius remained on his knees, forehead pressed to the ground, body curled up, still catching his breath. The pain eased gradually, but a deeper sting, humiliation at being felled by a single blow, rose up and hurt more than the physical wound. Regulus didn't look back. He turned and walked toward Orion. Orion stood by the wall, watching, the corners of his eyes twitching slightly. His plan had been for Regulus to show his power through 27 and technique, to let Sirius see the gap between them and awaken his competitive spirit. He hadn't expected Regulus to handle it this way. Close quarters, physical strike, finished in one hit. Still, the result seemed effective. Sirius could now lift his head. His eyes followed Regulus's retreating back, filled with anger and defiance, but mingled with something closer to awe. So it could be done like that? Orion said nothing, waiting for Sirius to rise. Sirius stood up, hands on his knees, bracing himself. His right rib still throbbed, but the pain was bearable. He bent to retrieve his 28, gripped it, and started toward the 22 door. Orion reached out and stopped him. Next, Orion said flatly, without looking at him, Regulus and I will have a match. You watch. Sirius froze. The anger drained from his face and was replaced by a cold, hard expression. He nodded and backed to the wall, arms folded. He wanted to watch. There was plenty of fury at how he'd been struck, but beneath it a gnawing confusion. How big was the gap between him and Regulus? In that duel, Regulus hadn't even gone all out. He hadn't raised his 28, just walked over and punched, and it was over. The scale of that difference unsettled him. On a magical level, he might come to understand it, but the idea of resolving a magical duel with physical combat was beyond his immediate comprehension. He wanted to see how Regulus would fare against their father. From the bystander's vantage, he wanted to see how far Regulus had come. In the center of the room, Orion and Regulus took their places, 15 feet apart. Orion flexed his wrist, spun his 28 once on his fingertips, and gripped it. This time Regulus raised his 28. The fight began. Nearly half a year had passed since Regulus last sparred Orion in this 22. Back then he had lost narrowly. Orion had used a blinding light spell to disrupt his vision, seizing the smallest opening to end the fight. On the surface, it had looked like a close loss, but the fact that Orion could control a duel so precisely only underscored the gulf between them. He controlled the rhythm, the intensity, the outcome. Everything was calculated. Regulus's progress over the past 6 months hadn't been dramatic in terms of raw spell repertoire. Mastering individual spells would increase combat power, but in the path of 27, that wasn't the same as true qualitative progress. He had learned the foundational spells in his first year. Increasing proficiency was possible, but achieving a fundamental change was hard. He hadn't stayed idle, though. He patched his mobility weaknesses. Side-along apparition, quickening charm, momentum arresto, and flying charm now combined to give him more options for small, rapid movements. Incorporating starry sky imagery into his magic increased spell power, but came with heavy costs, high consumption, and long preparation, making it hard to use in fast exchanges. Space Leap spell could be a trump card to test his father. Apart from the killing curse, the other unforgivable curses might be usable. Natural magic still wasn't suited to conventional combat, and fiendfire was out of the question against his father. They stood in the center, 15 feet apart. As Regulus bowed, his consciousness sank inward. He began mobilizing starry sky imagery. He constructed the image in his mind, letting it resonate with his 27 power, and chose the supernova explosion imagery, symbolizing ultimate eruption, perfect for boosting explosive spells. The image completed and synchronized with his 27. Both men raised their 28s at once. No formal start was called. The duel ignited the moment the wands were up. From the tip of Regulus's 28 burst an orange-red beam, a great blasting curse. But at its core, tiny points of deep crimson light flickered. Traces of 27 power merged with the starry sky imagery. The air tore as the spell left the wand. The temperature along its path spiked, scorching the stone floor. Orion's spell arrived at the same time, a silent, cutting curse. A silver arc of light slashed in from the side, aiming for Regulus's right arm, the one holding the 28. Regulus didn't try to take the hit. He activated side-along apparition and shifted 3 feet to the left. The arc grazed his sleeve and struck the wall where protective runes flared and absorbed it. He didn't stop on landing. He chained a quickening charm and darted to the right, widening the distance. Orion didn't evade the incoming great blasting curse either. He raised his left hand, palm outward, and a shield charm barrier sprang up, silvery white and translucent, with fine streams of 27 power running over its surface. The spell slammed into the barrier with a tremendous impact. Boom! The explosion was far louder than a normal blasting curse. A conventional blast made a low boom that radiated outward. Regulus's was different. You could hear the difference in the force. Orange-red firelight erupted over the barrier. The impact made the shield tremble. Its surface rippled like disturbed water with chaotic waves. Behind the barrier, Orion's brow tightened and his right hand poured more 27 into stabilizing the shield. This strike had exceeded his expectation. A normal blasting curse wouldn't have phased his shield charm, but Regulus's blow had nearly ruptured it. The force was at least 5 times stronger. The room's protective runes lit up as they absorbed the dissipating air. The air filled with the smell of scorched stone and the ozone tang of burnt. Sirius stood by the door, mouth open, eyes wide. He just fired a blasting curse at Regulus earlier, and it hadn't even lifted the hem of his clothes. But Regulus's strike, was it even the same kind of blasting curse? A thought hit him. If that had struck me, I might be gone. Regulus wasn't surprised his strike hadn't finished Orion. If a single starry sky-augmented spell could take down his father, he'd have to suspect his father was an imposter. But he had caught a momentary opening as Orion supplemented the shield's 27 to stabilize it. That brief distraction was enough. Regulus shifted position inside the 22, and on landing tapped his 28. Expelliarmus! A red light shot out. Orion didn't take the hit. He stepped aside, and the bolt flew past his shoulder. He responded immediately with an enhanced incendio. Brilliant white flames spread in a fan, sealing off Regulus's left flank. Regulus used the flying charm to spring into the air, vaulting over the flames, and while airborne, hurled a confringo aimed at Orion's head. Orion retreated. The explosion sent fragments of stone slabs flying. He waved a hand and swatted the fragments into dust that drifted down like ash. As Regulus landed, he activated Momentum Arresto to accelerate and pull away, and at the same time jabbed his 28 again. Defindo, Repelling Charm, Impedimenta. The 3 spells fired almost simultaneously, at tricky angles, trying to seal Orion's upper, middle, and lower lines. Orion stuffed himself into a full-body shield charm, silvery white and wrapping him completely, to absorb the attacks. The spells struck the barrier and burst into colored sparks. The shield shook violently but held with incredible stability. The distance between them shifted constantly. Basic spells were proving difficult to land. Regulus's shield charm, bolstered by starry sky imagery, was extremely steady. Orion's shield charm, honed by decades of experience, had a firm 27 output and broad coverage. Both men knew the next moves would get serious. Orion was the first to change tactics. His point traced a complex pattern, and a dark red mist billowed from its tip. Regulus recognized it instantly. It wasn't strictly dark arts, but a kind of 3 that eroded at power on contact and weakened spells that passed through it. The mist spread fast. Regulus pulled back while flicking out an aguamenti. The jet of water dispersed much of the mist, but some residue still touched the hem of his robes. The fabric immediately dulled and turned gray, as if corroded by accelerated time. Chapter 144, Collision in the Dark. Regulus didn't slow his pace. He pointed his wand at the hem of his robe. A flash of light passed, and the corrosion stopped, though it had clearly burned through more of his magical reserves. He sent a silent Expelliarmus at Orion. The red jet of light was concealed by the edge of the mist, aimed straight for Orion's chest. Orion sidestepped to avoid it, the wand in his hand pressing down with the momentum. Impedimenta! The blue light flew past, and Regulus used side-along apparition to dodge. The spell struck a wooden target behind him, and the target immediately toppled. As he landed, Regulus flicked his wand upward. Confringo! The blast of Confringo shot toward Orion's upper body. Orion leaned back. The explosion missed him, striking the ceiling and setting the protective runes to glow. Taking advantage of the brief pause after Regulus's cast, Orion pointed his wand forward. Petrificus Totalis! The Petrificus Totalis was blindingly fast. Regulus had time for only half a step to the side before the spell nicked his left shoulder. His left arm stiffened instantly. He forced his magical energy inward and broke the bind, but his movements were still half a beat behind. Orion seized the opening, sealing Regulus's back with 3 consecutive impedimenta and raising his wand at the same time. Stupefy! The red beam of the stupefy cut straight and true. Trapped between the translucent walls formed by the impedimenta, Regulus's space to move was severely limited. He didn't panic. He pointed his wand down. Ground trap! The stone floor beneath his feet sagged, his body sank, and the stupefy flew over his head. He sprang out of the pit. The numbness in his left arm lingered, but he had mobility again. Orion admired how Regulus moved. He recognized the movement repertoire: side-along apparition, quickening charm, flying charm, momentum arresto, material from the Ministry of Magic Auror training manual. But Regulus used them so naturally, the transitions as effortless as breathing, maintaining spell output while on the move. That fluency wasn't raw talent alone, it required massive practice. Every spell's cooldown, magical cost, and trajectory carved into muscle memory. Regulus had claimed he hadn't made much progress, but Orion could see otherwise. In direct combat, he was approaching the level of an elite Auror, years ahead of where Regulus had said he was. And Orion knew Regulus was still holding back. The 3 unforgivable curses, Fiendfire, Patronus, Space Magic, Natural Magic, none had been used yet. Orion let his thoughts flicker only briefly before clamping down. With Regulus at this level, distraction was fatal. On the field, Regulus had already diagnosed the problem. Their duel had become a stalemate: high defense, low offense. Both shield charms were stubborn enough that ordinary spells barely penetrated. Their mobility made it hard to lock onto a target. If the attrition continued, it would come down to reserves of magic and endurance, and Regulus knew he wouldn't last longer than Orion. He needed to break the deadlock. One of the unforgivable curse's defining traits was that they were, in effect, undefendable. The shield charm didn't stop Crucio, and it certainly didn't stop the killing curse. Crucio could be resisted by sheer will, and Avada could be dodged or blocked by objects, but at least they ignored the shimmering barrier. After another confringo, Regulus moved his left index finger almost imperceptibly. A scarlet thread shot from his fingertip, silent and hidden within the explosive flash and the dust, heading straight for Orion's chest. Crucio. Orion's brow furrowed. His figure vanished. Regulus's analysis was instant. This wasn't a disillusionment charm, wasn't a high-speed maneuver, certainly not space magic. Orion had truly disappeared, his magical signature gone as if snuffed. At the same moment, the dueling hall fell into absolute darkness. His sight remained, not blinded but swallowed. Every light in the hall went out. The protective runes on the walls went dead, the torches extinguished, and even the faint glitter at the tip of Regulus's wand was devoured by the dark. It was thick, almost tactile. He could not see his own hand, could not make out his body. Astonishment flickered through Regulus, but he reacted instantly. He sighed along, apparated 5 feet to the left, and landed soundlessly. He raised his left hand. Lumos. A high-intensity lumos condensed in his palm, a ball of light bright enough to fill the entire dueling hall. But as soon as it formed, the light spread only half a meter before striking an invisible boundary. Light and darkness met and rebuked each other at that edge. He watched tiny motes of light at the boundary get swallowed by the darkness like snowflakes vanished in flame. Instantly, he extinguished the light ball. Any illumination might give away his position. Since light was being suppressed, vision was useless. He closed his eyes and pushed his magic perception to the limit. The result was unexpected. His perceptive range was compressed. Where he'd normally sensed dozens of meters, he could only perceive 5. Beyond 5 meters, there was nothing, a void. Within 5 meters, his senses were muffled, shapes blurred, and details lost. There was no time to think. Spells began to strike. Without warning or visible source, a cutting curse flashed 3 meters to his right, a silver arc slashing for his neck. Regulus dodged. The arc grazed his shoulder and tore through his robe. Before he could steady himself, a translucent impedimenta rose on his left, sealing his retreat. He sprang upward, using the flying charm to hover for a moment. An incendio licked past below, the heat singed the soles of his shoes. Orion's spells came from everywhere, the origin points unpredictable. 1 second a curse launched from the front, the next it erupted from behind. Regulus could only rely on his 5-meter magic perception as early warning and use movement combos to dodge. It was a passive strategy and too risky. He called to mind a family heirloom of magic, the shadow tracking curse left by Cassandra Black, an ancestor from the 12th century. That spell let the caster blend with shadows, achieving true invisibility and short-range teleportation. This darkness, which suppressed light and perception, might be a variant of that ancestral magic. Regulus tried to summon a Patronus, expecto patronum, a silvery white glow condensed at the tip of his wand, forming the outline of the starry sky kite. The moment it appeared, the silver light dispersed the darkness in a small radius. The gloom retreated 2 meters. He sent the Patronus outward, but beyond that 2-meter bubble, he could no longer sense it. The link felt cut or blocked. He tried to recall it. No response. He was forced to cancel the spell. The starry sky kite dissolved into pinpricks of light. The darkness closed in again. Sirius stood at the doorway, frozen. His mouth hadn't closed since the duel began. The way Regulus and Orion fought shattered everything he'd imagined a wizard's duel could be. It wasn't the careless spell-slinging of students. This was real combat. High-speed movement, tactical deception, use of the environment, precise combinations. He'd watched Regulus sidelong apparat out of a cutting curse, instantly chain into a quickening charm to create distance. He'd seen Orion tank a confringo with a shield charm, then top up his magic to stabilize the barrier. He'd seen them use impedimenta, incendio, and expelliarmus at 10-meter range to restrain movement. Regulus had cast a confringo mid-air while crossing a wall of fire with a flying charm. Every action served a purpose. No flashy gestures, only efficiency and lethality. What shocked him most was how they cast. Often their wands weren't even pointed at the opponent when the spells fired. Orion's cutting curse whipped from his side with a curved trajectory, bypassing Regulus's frontal defenses. Regulus's confringo struck the ground to disrupt Orion's footing and ruin his next spell. These techniques were far beyond anything taught at Hogwarts. Then the darkness came down. It swallowed the whole hall. Sound seemed to vanish too, absorbed and isolated by the gloom. Sirius could hear only his own breath and heartbeat, and yet he couldn't look away. He strained to see, to spot even the smallest flicker of light or movement. The pain in his right ribs faded. The only thing left in his head was one urgent thought. What was happening inside? Was Regulus finished? What sort of magic was Orion using? How long would the darkness last? Each second stretched into an agony of waiting. Inside the darkness, Regulus moved at full speed. Vision was useless. Magic perception had shrunk to 5 meters. He had to rely on that narrow bubble as an early warning and on probability and luck to guess where Orion was. He changed direction unpredictably within the hall, chaining side-along apparition with quickening charm, pivoting on landing, accelerating with momentum arresto, and occasionally using the flying charm to change altitude. Chapter 145. This was brutal. The darkness had been aimed squarely at him. For Orion, it was familiar terrain. Orion could see in it, perceive within it, move freely in that shadow, and cast spells at will. Regulus, by contrast, was blind, forced to absorb blows he could neither anticipate nor evade. Regulus's mind raced. The shadow stealth charm worked by blending into and riding shadows. This was a super shadow Orion had made. To break it, Regulus either needed a stronger light to disperse the darkness, or had to find the caster's true body and interrupt the spell. His own light wasn't strong enough. The silver glow of the starry sky kite only dispersed 2 meters around him and was suppressed beyond that. He could try a flashing charm, empowered by the image of a supernova burst, but that required time to build the imagery, time Orion wouldn't grant in this blackness. That left locating the caster. He adjusted the frequency of his magical perception constantly, trying to pierce whatever shielding the darkness provided. He pushed his spatial sense to the limit, too. The shadow stealth charm involved merging into shadows and using them to achieve teleportation. Not true spatial travel, but there would theoretically be residual spatial fluctuations. Time lost meaning in the dark, 1 minute, 5 minutes, until at last he registered something abnormal. A subtle spatial fluctuation, faint but distinct in the absolute blackness, about 4.5 meters to his front left. Immediately after came a magical fluctuation in the same spot, its intensity rising. Orion was preparing a spell. Regulus didn't hesitate. He raised his wand in his right hand and prepared Space Leap and Space Anchor at once. To avoid any passive defenses like a constant shield charm, he decided to open the spatial tunnel directly onto the caster's skin. For a moment, he even considered opening it beneath the skin, but rejected the thought. This was his father, and he couldn't use lethal force. Besides, living magic would make such a tunnel impossible to stabilize. The tunnel opened instantly 4.5 meters to his front left. Regulus pointed his wand through it, and a scarlet beam, Crucio, fired, passing through the tunnel with surgical aim. It should have struck Orion's chest. Anticipation rose in Regulus. This duel had been brutal. Suppressed by darkness and forced to take blows passively, he felt wronged. Crucio might not break a wizard with iron will, but even half a second of weakness would let him follow up and turn the tide. The expected feedback never came. In the darkness ahead, the spatial and magical fluctuations were still present, but his Crucio seemed to have hit only void. No impact, no resistance. Regulus's heart sank. Then agony exploded through him. It felt like a million red-hot needles driving into every inch of his skin, burrowing into muscle and bone. The pain did not come from outside. It erupted from within, tearing at him on a cellular level. His body locked, breath snatched away, vision collapsing into black, despite the literal darkness already surrounding him. He reacted on instinct. He'd fallen into a trap. The spatial and magical fluctuations he'd seen had been bait, deliberately released by Orion. The real attack had come from somewhere else. Pain dulled his thoughts and slowed his physical reflexes. He forced his consciousness deep, using a clumency to strip away awareness of the suffering, but that took time. In the dark, a hand settled on his shoulder. The pressure wasn't heavy, but it was perfectly placed, pressing down on the exertion point for his quickening charm. At the same time, something cold and hard touched his throat, the tip of a wand, close enough to feel its chill and the tightness of its press. The darkness peeled back like a curtain. Light flooded the room again. The rune-etched walls glowed, the torches flared to life, and everything returned to its original state. Orion stood before him, the wand at Regulus's throat, his left hand on the younger man's shoulder. They were less than a foot apart. Regulus could see the fine sweat on his father's brow and smell the faint tang of singed cloth from a fire charm. Orion didn't look as composed as at the start. His dark gray combat robes bore scorch marks and corrosion. His left cuff was sliced open to reveal a protective layer beneath. A few strands of hair stuck to his forehead, and his breathing was a little quick. Still, he stood firm, hands steady, eyes clear. Regulus was worse off. His training tunic was torn in places. His left shoulder still ached from the residue of petrificus totalis, and his cells, having been baptized by Crucio, twitched with phantom pain. He looked pale, but he stood upright. His eyes were tired but focused. Orion's expression was almost overflowing with approval. The corners of his mouth tilted into a smile that he tried to suppress but couldn't, and finally he allowed it. He withdrew his wand and gave Regulus's shoulder a firm pat with his free hand. "Very good," Orion said, satisfaction in his voice. "Regulus, very good." Regulus bowed his head and breathed in. When he looked up, he smiled too, saying nothing more than a firm nod. They stepped apart slightly and both adjusted their breathing. The duel had not lasted long, but its intensity had been extreme. With their guard down, exhaustion washed over them. Regulus moved his left shoulder, using minor magic to flush out the last stubborn remnants of petrification. The phantom pain from the Crucio eased. His father had not struck with full force, only enough to make him show a weakness. If Orion had gone all out, Regulus would be writhing on the floor. He went over the trap in his head. Everything had felt authentic. The spatial fluctuation, the magic signature, the position and strength. Each one matched the precursors he usually perceived before Orion cast. But it had been a deception. Orion had simulated those signatures to lure him into attacking, while the real body had approached from another angle and ended the duel with Crucio. The old man had clearly anticipated any space magic counter and had a contingency for it. That trap had been designed to force his trump card and then counter it. The thought brought helpless admiration. This was his father. Decades of combat experience, flawless control of the situation, an unparalleled read on people's psychology. They both looked toward the door. Sirius still stood there, mouth open, eyes vacant as if struck by a full petrificus totalis. He looked from Regulus to Orion and back again, his mind still processing. The sudden descent of darkness, the father who had vanished, a wand at a throat, and finally, both of them smiling. Regulus and Orion exchanged a glance and found the hint of amusement in each other's eyes. Orion walked to the door and, as he passed, patted Sirius on the shoulder. "Did you understand?" he asked. Sirius nodded mechanically, then shook his head and at last managed, "I didn't understand at all." Orion's smile faded. In a flat voice he said, "Then think about it slowly." He pushed the chamber door open, looked back at Regulus, and added, "Rest for half an hour, then come to the study. We'll talk about the holiday arrangements." The door closed. Only Regulus and Sirius remained. Sirius blinked and finally came to. He walked over to Regulus and examined him as if seeing him for the first time. "You," he started and stopped. Then after a long pause, "Are you always like this at school?" "No," Regulus replied with a small shake of his head. "I can't be like this at school. And all that, the movement, the spells, that darkness at the end." Sirius's words trailed off. His stubborn glare had softened into bewilderment. "Is that from practice?" Regulus moved toward the door, and Sirius stepped aside. Then he hurried to overtake Regulus, turned, and stared blunt. "Do you and father fight like this often?" This was the second time," Regulus said after taking a sip of water brought by the house elf. "I lost the first time. And this time, I lost this time too." Regulus's answer was flat. Sirius fell silent. He watched Regulus set the cup back on its tray and brush his messy hair off his forehead. The motions were ordinary, almost casual, and yet they made Regulus seem composed, proper, even elegant. Sirius didn't like the calm rhythm. It felt contrived and restrained. Still, the anger that had burned in him earlier slipped away, replaced by something harder to name. He thought of the Regulus in the chamber, moving at high speed, firing spell after spell with staggering power, eyes cool and focused. Compared to the deliberate, measured boy now before him, they seemed like two different people. He could not tell which one was real. Sirius showed no expression when he returned to his room. Regulus, however, could feel the magical energy within him stirred into activity, as if some intense emotion had been lit and was coursing through him. That was good, whether it was a hunger for revenge after being bested or the thrill from watching the duel. As long as it instilled in Sirius a desire to grow stronger, the goal had been met. Regulus stopped thinking about him. If Sirius truly wanted it, father would arrange the rest. He went to his own room, took a shower, and changed into fresh robes. Enchantment and fixing charms could solve many things, but one could not live entirely by magic. Magic is useful, but life itself needed to be lived. After a quick refresh, he went to the study. Orion was already at his desk, working through papers, his quill scratching across parchment. Regulus had the impression his father never had leisure. There were always more documents. Wizengamot reports, family business correspondence, letters from other pure-blood houses, and issues where the House of Black had to take a stance. Given the display of strength Orion had just shown, it had been while he was delayed by tedious work. Regulus thought for a moment how powerful his father might be if he devoted himself wholly to his magic, but he pushed the thought aside. The head of the House of Black had to balance magical power with worldly affairs. Magical strength could protect the family, but connections, industry, and political capital were equally important. Without those, raw power would be isolated, besieged, and eventually exhausted, unless one reached the level of Dumbledore, Grindelwald, or Voldemort, clearly not his father. Besides, Orion had managed the House of Black well enough. Orion heard him come in, didn't look up, and only said, "Sit, wait a moment." Regulus took the armchair opposite. A row of ancestral portraits lined the wall. Phineas Nigellus had his eyes half closed, while the others murmured among themselves, their gazes flicking to Regulus from time to time. After 5 minutes, Orion put down his quill and pushed the papers aside. He leaned back, hands folded over his stomach, and asked first about Sirius. "Regulus, how is Sirius doing at school?" His tone was flat, unreadable, but Regulus could tell his father was displeased by Sirius's performance. Comparisons cut deep. If there were no Regulus, or if Regulus weren't so exceptional, Sirius might even be considered excellent. Playful and careless, yes, but gifted by blood enough to stand out among his year. Compared to those young wizards who had both raw talent and the discipline to improve themselves systematically, however, he lagged. Pureblood families compared heirs. Sirius did not stand up well to that measuring stick. Rebellious, often absent for holidays, the eldest son of the House of Black in Gryffindor, others tacitly avoided mentioning it in Orion's presence. Regulus knew all this, and it wasn't possible not to care. Calling Sirius home for the long break was as much about saving face as it was about improving his magical ability. Regulus also knew his father hoped the son positioned as the family's light-side backup would gain more confidence. After all, he was his son. What could Regulus say? That Sirius spent nights out, played pranks, and brawled with James Potter until points were deducted? He shook his head slightly. "I don't really know," he said. He truly hadn't paid close attention to Sirius's day-to-day at Hogwarts. Orion didn't press. The head of the house certainly knew, or would be informed. He knew Regulus's own record, both in magic and in managing affairs, and was as satisfied as a father could be. But Sirius, any parent who cared at all about a child's education would be troubled by his deeds. Regulus looked at his father's impassive face and knew Sirius would not have an easy holiday. That was fine. The question was whether Sirius's newfound hunger would survive his father's regimen and how long he could keep it up. Orion moved on. "Do you have plans for the holiday?" Regulus felt a small stir. If his father asked, the matter had likely been considered by one of his parents. He wanted to voice his own preference first. Social engagements weren't unwelcome, but he'd only just finished his first year and had already made a public appearance at the Malfoys' Christmas banquet last year. Those who needed to know him already did. Given how much attention he might draw, he preferred to lie low over the break. He supposed his father felt the same. "Practice," he said. "I have a few new ideas for spells that will take time to test." Orion raised an eyebrow. "House elf's space magic?" He was referring to what had happened during the duel, Regulus making a spell appear at the dummy target's position. Though the attack hadn't landed, the effect of something manifesting out of nowhere had been startling. Regulus nodded and lifted an eyebrow in invitation. Orion leaned forward, elbows on the desk, eyes asking if he could be shown. Regulus obliged. He raised his left hand and pointed his index finger. A thread of silver light formed at his fingertip and rippled the air in front of him. In the center of the ripple, a translucent window took shape. On the other side of it, across Orion's desk, was the ink bottle. Regulus waved his right hand, and the bottle began to rise, slowly and deliberately. It passed through the window and vanished into the ripple. At the very same moment, space fluctuated above a stack of files by Orion's left, and the bottle appeared there, settling on the desk without wobbling. The whole demonstration took less than a second. That was only to show his father clearly. In normal use, the window wasn't necessary, and there was no visible process. Orion's eyes widened as he stared at the ink bottle. He had suspected Regulus might have mastered a form of spatial technique during the duel, but to see a physical object teleported with his own eyes quickened his breath. He remembered what Regulus had once described, folding 2 points on a map until they touched, and what had seemed abstract then suddenly made perfect sense. But a problem surfaced. Object teleportation and spell teleportation were not the same. The silver light still lingered at Regulus's fingertip. He didn't speak. He took his wand in his right hand and traced a complex path in the air, the space anchor charm. After setting the anchor, he turned his wand to the window and sent out a red beam of Expelliarmus. It was not meant as an attack. He slowed its speed, as if it were moving through water. The red beam entered the window and, without visible transition, reappeared on the other side, striking the bookshelf by the wall with a light thunk. Spell teleportation. Orion's composure thinned. His eyes were wide, his body leaning forward over the desk as he stared at the space passage. Even though he had already suspected Regulus had achieved spell teleportation, seeing it with his own eyes brought the shock of the rules of magic being rewritten. Regulus caught that expression. A tiny swell of pride rose in him. Rarely did he have the chance to make his father watch him like this. Usually, the lessons went the other way, and the reversal felt good. "Want to learn? I'll teach you," he said. But because he was still his father, he immediately began to explain. The spell structure is divided into 3 parts. His wand traced silver trails in the air as he spoke. First, sense the spatial structure of the target area. Second, guide your magical power to fold space and form a passage. Third, stabilize the edges of the passage to prevent collapse. He slowed his gestures so Orion could follow each motion. He explained the pronunciation of the incantations and emphasized, when folding, do not use too much force, or the space will tear and things will get stuck halfway. This is the Space Leap spell, he said, keeping his tone level to hide his pride. It can only teleport objects. Size and distance increase with proficiency. You cannot teleport spells with it alone. You must combine it with the Space Anchor Charm to stabilize the passage. He cast the Space Anchor Charm again. The anchor point must be placed on the inner wall of the passage, not in the center. If you put it in the center, you'll pin the passage shut, and the spell won't be able to pass. Regulus didn't know whether his father had the inheritance for the Space Anchor Charm, but even if he hadn't, the inheritance lay ready and would be enormously helpful to learn from. He demonstrated twice more while Orion watched, his fingers idly moving on the desk in time with the gestures. On the third repetition, Orion cleared his throat. That's enough. Regulus suppressed a smile, put away his wand, lifted his teacup, and took a sip, his expression settling back into seriousness. Orion was a little dazed. He watched Regulus finish demonstrating the spell, then explain its structure and key points with crystalline clarity. It was no longer a theory or a half-formed idea. It was a complete technique, finished to a degree that could be taught to others. A complex tide of emotions rose in Orion's chest: gratification, pride, and a small, unexpected tenderness. My son has stepped ahead of me. My son can do things like this. Truly, my son. A trace of loss passed through him. His son could already teach him this technique. In certain fields, Regulus had begun to surpass him, his father. Time moved faster than he expected. He forced the sentiment down. As head of the House of Black, and as a father, he could not indulge in mushy feelings. His role was to support, provide resources, and let Regulus fly higher. He turned his attention back to the Space Leap spell. Orion drew his own wand, cedar wood with a dragon heartstring core, the same one he had used for over 30 years. He replayed Regulus's gestures and recited the incantation, lifting his wand and tracing the same trajectory in the air. On the first try, the magical output was unstable. The spatial ripple dissipated halfway through. He adjusted and tried again. The ink bottle floated up, passed cleanly through the channel, and reappeared above the pile of documents. Success! Orion put his wand away and looked at the ink bottle, his voice edged with amazement. Regulus, you continue to surprise me. A smile flickered at the corner of Regulus's mouth. He inclined his head slightly. Thank you, Father. He wasn't being modest. Developing a spell independently like that was genuinely impressive. Conversation returned to holiday arrangements. Orion didn't want Regulus wasting a break on fruitless socializing. Walburga insisted on many gatherings, but Regulus was clearly in a period of rapid advancement. Orion decided to overrule his wife. During the holidays, focus on practicing the Space Leap technique, he said. If you need anything, say so. The materials, books, and artifacts in the house are at your disposal. If you need to go somewhere else, tell me in advance and I will arrange it. Regulus nodded. Understood. But you can't spend the whole break holed up practicing, Orion added. There's a task I want to entrust to you. Regulus braced himself for the change of subject. You'll practice at home for a month. After that, I'll arrange a family mission for you, something leaning toward practical combat. Orion relaxed into his chair. It's tradition in the House of Black that heirs start being involved in certain affairs around their 6th or 7th year, once they have the capabilities of an adult wizard. But you're progressing far too quickly. Waiting that long would be pointless. Regulus listened without surprise. He knew the house had its unorthodox matters handled by trusted agents who reported to Orion, matters the heir would learn through assignments, hunting down dark wizards who damaged family interests, rooting out hostile informants, handling conflicts unsuitable for public attention. He needed practical combat. His real fighting experience was nearly non-existent. The Nocturne Alley incident had Orion present, and the opposition had been weak. The astronomy tower affair had ended with Dumbledore's intervention. School squabbles were children's games. Facing his father in a duel had always felt constrained, his mind held back by concerns. He needed a true opponent to test how much of his training could be applied under life-or-death pressure. But there were technical problems to solve first. The combination of space leap and anchoring needed to be more stable. At present, he could transmit only one spell before the channel collapsed. Control over Fiendfire still had room for improvement. Splitting into two birds was his limit. To split further, he would need stronger control, perhaps the ability to divide his spirit. Natural magic was still at an elementary stage. He could extract magical output from plants for temporary use, but he wanted a way to solidify those characteristics. And then there was the matter of the mandrake, something he had never stopped thinking about. "Practice without distraction," Orion said. "I'll speak to your mother." Regulus nodded more firmly than before. He knew how to handle Walburga, appear obedient, steer the conversation when necessary, and appeal to her sense of family glory and strength. But once she had decided he should make a social appearance, changing her mind was difficult. Orion's intervention was the most effective route. A small, approving smile crossed Orion's face, as if he'd read his son's strategy. Finally, the topic shifted to Sirius. Orion asked, "Which direction do you think Sirius should pursue?" Regulus didn't hesitate. "Transfiguration. He has the talent." Orion considered this, nodded, and said no more. "First day home. Rest. You're dismissed." Regulus walked back down the corridor toward his room. Passing Sirius's door, his magical perception picked up an anomaly. Someone was pressed to the door listening. Young wizards often didn't regulate their magical output well. It showed plainly in Regulus's senses. Most adults were similar, though the sophisticated could mask it, either by restraint or by hiding magic with magic, an advanced technique he'd glimpsed only in the restricted section. When footsteps drew nearer, the shape against the door froze, no longer moving, pretending not to be there. Regulus stopped and raised his hand to knock. There was a pause, then the door cracked open. Sirius stood there with an awkward, guilty look, trying to act as if nothing had happened. Regulus only raised a brow. "Not going to invite me in?" Sirius pressed his lips together, then turned aside to let him enter. Regulus stepped into the room and took in the scene. 2 cups of tea on the desk, still steaming. They were set out very neatly, not casually. He turned to Sirius. The younger boy stared at a Quidditch team poster on the wall, avoiding Regulus's eyes. Regulus hadn't been in this room for years. Ever since Sirius's relationship with the family had soured, this bedroom had become the only territory he claimed at Grimmauld Place, a sanctuary he wanted untouched. He no longer let Regulus in, didn't invite him, didn't share it, as if trying to draw a firm line. This was Sirius, the Gryffindor's space, not a place the heir of the Blacks should enter. Regulus said nothing. He moved to the desk, picked up a cup, and sipped. The tea was the right temperature, sweetened with honey, the sort Sirius would drink. The act was deliberate. He was telling Sirius, "I know you waited for me. I know this cup was for me." Sirius's face tightened. He stood by the doorway with his hands in his pockets, ready to show a guest out. Thoughts raced behind his eyes. How was Regulus meant to be classified? Enemy? Not exactly. There was blood between them. Family? Not really. Regulus's path would likely lead him into the pure-blood faction, possibly into the orbit of Lord Voldemort. In Sirius's rough understanding, that meant they might one day stand opposed, wands raised on opposite sides of a battlefield. And yet Regulus was his younger brother, the boy whose presence still tugged at him across crowded school tables, whose name made his ears perk up in conversation. The contradiction left him unsettled. He had had time to think, to consider what was behind the evening's events. Regulus hadn't sought him out for spite, and Orion wouldn't have arranged that duel for nothing. The message was clear. Power matters. Without it, you are vulnerable. You can choose whatever path you like, but first you must be able to protect yourself. Otherwise, the next person to use force against you may well be an enemy. Sirius drew a long breath. Then, unable to contain his curiosity any longer, he asked, "How did you do it?" He braced himself for a dismissal. Pure-blood families guarded many secrets, ancient lore, forbidden knowledge, bloodline magic. Those things weren't always shared, even within a family. Regulus could easily brush the question off or claim it was some private family secret, and Sirius would be left with nothing. Regulus heard him, but didn't answer right away. He stole a look at Sirius and felt a flicker of relief. The fact that Sirius had taken the initiative to ask meant he'd started thinking about power, that beating hadn't been entirely in vain. No matter how much aftershock the blow had left, it was at least a beginning. But how did you do it was too broad. Regulus didn't know where to start. Should he talk about his scientific mindset and habit of treating magic as an analyzable system? Mention the magic control practice that let him cast wandless and nonverbal spells years ago? Bring up his innate magic perception, which allowed him to sense subtle flows of magic? Or the star orbit meditation he practiced every night, keeping soul, body, and magic growing in sync? All of those were answers, but none would really help. Talent couldn't be copied, training methods differed by person, and ways of thinking were rooted in personality and experience. He set down his teacup. "Thinking," he finally said. Sirius's brow creased. "Thinking." His expression darkened. "Who doesn't know how to think? Think about what? Textbook knowledge? What professors teach?" It came out like a scolded child's complaint. Regulus didn't bother with reassurance. "Think about what you're good at. Think about what magic means to you. Think about what you want to accomplish with it, and what you're willing to pay to get there." Sirius's face shifted, anger melting into confusion. Regulus understood the situation in the wizarding world. Most wizards stayed at the level of being able to use a spell, pick the right one at the right time, and get the job done. Some tried to use spells better, push for more power, make magic do more. Academic wizards studied principles, looking for the logic behind spells, inventing new ones and new applications. Combat-focused wizards trained for lethality. Very few people asked the deeper questions. What is my magical path? What am I truly good at? Which way should I go? Regulus had found his path, but it wasn't something he could hand to Sirius. Telling him outright would be meaningless and might even get in his way. For most people, finding a talent at all was luck. He picked up a small copper ring from the table. Probably a toy Sirius had left, and spun it once on his fingertip. Some are born to transfiguration, some are sensitive to potions, some master combat spells easily. Find the field you're good at and dig deep. That's the first step. Sirius stared at the ring. "How do you know what you're good at?" "Try," Regulus said simply. "Try every branch of magic you can reach. See where you progress fastest, what feels natural, and what makes you want to keep studying." He said it because it was true in a broad sense, but he knew it was clumsy. It was inefficient, relied on luck, and wasted time. He thought of Ollivander's shop, where the old man could pick the single wand that matched a young wizard from thousands. If wands could be matched, couldn't a wizard's talent be detected? Was there a spell, ritual, or divination that could point to the path best suited for someone? Regulus kept the thought. When his power and knowledge grew, he wanted to pursue that direction. Even a prototype that hinted at talent would revolutionize magical education. But that was for the future. For now, he lacked the means. He also knew privately that Sirius's talent was likely transfiguration, but he didn't say so. Telling him would rob Sirius of the discovery process. Only what a person discovers for themselves will be truly cherished and fueled by passion. If the knowledge came from an enemy, Sirius might resent it and throw it away rather than nurture it. He was capable of that. But finding what you're good at isn't enough, Regulus went on. You need to figure out what magic means to you. Is it a tool, power, art, or something else? That answer shapes your attitude toward magic and determines how far you can go. He stopped there. Anything deeper would be too intimate. How much Sirius could extract from this and how far he would take it was his own business. The room fell quiet. The fire cracked. Sirius bowed his head in thought. He had never asked himself those questions. For him, magic had been spells learned at school, tools for life, and something thrown in fights. Expelliarmus to knock a wand away, the shield charm to block spells, stupefy to take someone down. He had never examined what he was truly good at. Transfiguration or charms, defense against the dark arts or potions, maybe divination. "Why are you telling me this?" Sirius asked. His face softened slightly, though his tone stayed blunt. Regulus didn't answer. He couldn't exactly say, to keep you alive." He stood, crossed the room toward the door, and paused by Sirius. "Good night, Sirius." Then he left. The door closed quietly behind him. Sirius remained where he was, looking at the two teacups on the table, one sipped from, the other untouched. Regulus returned to his room and opened the window. The summer night breeze blew in, heavy with London dampness. Fog obscured the sky. No stars could be seen. He hoped what he'd said would be useful, though the rest was up to Sirius. He lay down, closed his eyes, and began to plan. Starting tomorrow, the holiday would move into practice mode. A month was enough to push several key points a long way. The curtains swayed as the wind continued. Regulus ran over his training schedule once more and let his mind slip into star orbit meditation. Orion's 4.5 stars glowed in the darkness. The 5th star was still half a step away. Time to sleep. The next morning at 9, in the training hall, Orion tested Sirius's level of magic. The content was simple: Expelliarmus, Shield Charm, Impedimenta, Repelling Charm, Stupefy in sequence, followed by several counter curses from Defense Against the Dark Arts. The results were disappointing. Sirius could use magic, but only at a utilitarian level. His Expelliarmus flashed bright red but flew in a straight, predictable line with no variation. His Shield Charm took form but was uneven and had obvious weak points. The Impedimenta had a tiny range and barely lasted. The Repelling Charm lacked force, and the Stupefy was slow and easy to dodge. It wasn't that Hogwarts had failed him. Sirius's grades weren't bad, and he had learned everything he should have. The issue was breadth and depth. He'd only mastered the standard classroom spells with almost no extracurricular expansion. His power was that of an excellent lower-year student, not someone on the verge of mastery. Orion was silent for a long time after the test. He looked at Sirius with a complicated expression and finally said, "Wait here." He left the hall and returned half an hour later with someone else. Gerald Hawke, a wizard in his early 40s, thin, with short gray hair and a long scar running from eyebrow to cheek, had once spent 10 years in the Auror office before an injury forced him into retirement. Orion had recruited him to handle family matters and train newcomers. "For the next 2 weeks," Orion told Sirius, "Mr. Hawke will teach you the basics. Do as he says." Sirius's expression soured. He'd imagined becoming stronger through duels, breaking through in combat, or learning some flashy, powerful spell. He hadn't expected to be drilled on fundamentals by an outsider. Still, he didn't object. Regulus's performance the night before lingered in his mind. He knew he was behind. Brushing up his basics first and then finding his own path could work too. Chapter 149, Mental Division. Regulus arrived at the second basement level, at the small 20, where he had practiced Fiendfire over the Easter holidays. He drew a book from his robes, Advanced Occlumency, Thought Structures and Defense Strategies, from the family's collection. He needed the 7 technique. He wanted to split his consciousness into 2 independent parts, each responsible for one Fiendfire bird, so they would operate without interfering with one another. Occlumency at a high level was not just about blocking intrusions. It covered building thought mazes, fabricating memories, and partitioning zones of consciousness. Regulus had focused on defense in earlier practice. Now he had to learn partitioning. He opened the chapter on consciousness partitioning. The principle was simple in concept. Imagine the mind as a great hall divided into rooms. Normally, all thoughts flowed through the hall together. Partitioning meant locking each room so that specific thoughts stayed in their designated spaces and did not mix. Implementation was another matter. He sat cross-legged and closed his eyes. First, he entered star orbit meditation. The Orion's 4.5 stars lit up in his mind with a steady glow. The meditation didn't grant the 7 ability by itself, but it steadied his mind and made his consciousness easier to shape. Following the book, he began building the first room inside his mental great hall. The walls were virtual, formed by will. He pictured the outline, the wall thickness, the door material. Imagining it was easy and the room took shape quickly, but it had no durability. The moment a thought surged, the walls shattered. He repeated the process, focusing will and spirit to make the walls feel real. 2 hours later, the first room stabilized. The second room went up faster, taking only an hour. Then came the hardest part, creating a passage between the two rooms so his primary consciousness could switch focus while keeping each chamber independent. If the passage was too wide, thoughts would mix, too narrow, and switching would lag. He tried 17 times before finding the balance. When he opened his eyes, there was light sweat on his brow, which vanished with a slight thought. The rooms had a substantial feel, built entirely of mental energy. The work was draining, his mind was fatigued, but he had succeeded. Half an hour of rest brought his mental energy back. He raised his hand, palm up. An orange-red flame sprang to life and formed into a small fiendfire bird. It perched in his palm, tilting its head and preening its feathers. Regulus controlled it from the first room. The sense of mastery was more delicate than before, because that portion of his consciousness was isolated, a unit dedicated to a specific task. Then he activated the second room. The moment his mind partitioned, it felt odd, like seeing two images at once. One image held the fiendfire bird in his right palm, the other was blank, waiting. He focused the blank on his left hand. A second flame sparked and took shape. Wings, tail feathers, head. Another small fiendfire formed and stood in his left palm. The two birds regarded one another, tilting their heads. The images overlapped, yet did not interfere. They didn't merge, the temperature didn't spike, and no violent aura spread. Their forms were stable. He made the bird in his right hand fly and circle the air, while the one in his left stayed in his palm, preening. Both actions occurred simultaneously, without affecting the other. It worked. Regulus maintained the state for 15 minutes before withdrawing. The birds extinguished, the rooms de-isolated, and his thoughts flowed as one again. During his break, his mind wandered. The 7 technique shouldn't be useful only for fiendfire. Space magic could use it. Maintaining space leap and space anchor at once was essentially multitasking. Occlumency defense could hide true memories in deep rooms and place false information in surface rooms to confuse intruders. He could even turn information into a weapon inside the rooms, let an intruder in and let them be tormented by assaults from the conscious level. Soul magic and consciousness sounded like a perfect fit. He should research that next. After half an hour's rest, he resumed practice. For the next 3 days, he spent 6 hours a day in the small 20. The fiendfire birds increased from 2 to 3, and his conscious rooms grew to 3 as well. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, 3 small fiendfire birds flew freely in the 20, chasing one another and occasionally chirping, all under his control. It was the most he could manage for now, and it was enough. He grinned at the progress. The small form of fiendfire had advantages. Discreet, flexible, suited to ambushes or precise operations. Having a bird slip into a room and then burst into a monstrous form beside a target, or multiple birds attacking different targets with guided precision. The partitioning had also improved his overall control. Fiendfire was gradually being tamed in his hands, ready for use. In the evening, Regulus left his dedicated 20 and glanced toward the main 20. Sirius was dueling Gerald Hawke. The session looked professional. Sirius moved while casting, using impedimenta to hamper motion, Expelliarmus as the primary attack, and the occasional Jelly Legs Jinx for interference. Hawke defended with the shield charm and countered with a simple repelling charm. His movements weren't fast, but he timed counters to catch Sirius at uncomfortable moments. It was clear Hawke was guiding the exercises, teaching rhythm, linking spells, and casting on the move. Each counter was calibrated to force a response without actually hurting Sirius. The training was effective. Sirius had improved since 3 days ago. His spell power had grown, his casting intervals shortened, and he'd learned to move while fighting. Sirius had also picked up a few uncommon but practical minor spells, likely Hawke's additions, like the Stick-Fast Hex to make the ground sticky and the Fogging Hex to blur vision. Combat awareness was budding. He used the environment for cover, shoved equipment racks with repelling charms to create obstacles, and even tried to transfigure ropes to trip opponents, unsuccessfully. This was the advantage of pureblood resources, a private tutor, a fully equipped 20, and a family library for extra study. Muggleborns had to learn many things from scratch. Talent mattered, but resources mattered more. Sirius had the House of Black's talent and was finally accessing its resources. As long as he practiced, his progress would outpace what school alone could offer. Regulus watched a while longer, then turned to leave. The study was right next to the 20, separated only by a door. Orion sat behind the desk reading documents. "Father," Regulus said softly. Orion looked up. "Finished practicing?" "Yes. Tomorrow I want to go to the 26 in Cornwall for a few days." Orion nodded. "All right, I'll inform them. Do you want someone to go with you?" "No, I'll go alone," Regulus replied. "Be safe." Orion gave a casual instruction. Then his gaze landed on Regulus's shoulder. A small orange-red bird had perched there, only the size of a sparrow, delicate, wings folded, tilting its head to look at the study's furnishings. Orion studied it a few seconds, not recognizing the creature. "This is—" "Fiendfire," Regulus answered briefly, and the bird gave a corresponding chirp. Orion's eyebrows rose. He knew Fiendfire, of course, but had never seen it so subdued. The little bird even looked almost cute, if one ignored that its essence was cursed flame. "You can control it to this extent?" Orion tried to keep his tone steady, but leaned forward on the desk's edge. "I'm still practicing." The bird fluttered up, circled the study once, and settled back on Regulus's shoulder with a hissing chirp. Orion exhaled and nodded, asking nothing further. It was enough to know Regulus could tame Fiendfire. If he could control it this finely, its power would be formidable when unleashed. "Go then," Orion waved. "Remember to eat properly. The house elf cooking at the 20s is only average. If you want something specific, tell them beforehand so they can prepare it." "I understand, Father." Regulus inclined his head. It felt oddly new to hear his father speak like that. He left the study and returned to his room. As he opened the bedroom door, the Fiendfire bird flew from his shoulder, circled once, and landed on the bedpost, folding its wings and closing its eyes like a real bird. Regulus hung up his outer robe, lay down, and thought of tomorrow's trip to the 26. He only hoped the mandrake wouldn't disappoint him. Chapter 150, Voldemort's Gift. Morning light sliced through the heavy curtains of 12 Grimmauld Place, falling in dark gold bars across the long oak dining table. The air smelled of fried eggs and bacon. Orion sat at the head of the table, the Daily Prophet folded open in his hands. His eyes skimmed a short item on page 3 about the ministry's new regulations on dark arts artifacts. Across from him, Walburga prodded the fried egg on her plate with a silver fork, her voice clear and sharp in the cavernous room. "The yolk is too hard, creature. I told you I wanted it runny. Do you understand? Runny?" By the fireplace, Sirius smacked his lips loudly and slumped in a high-backed chair, wearing a Muggle Band t-shirt with a long-haired singer screaming into a microphone. He didn't touch his food. He only scraped his fork along the porcelain, producing a thin, grating sound. Regulus sat at the far side of the table, farthest from the fire. His plate was clean. The eggs and bacon had already been eaten, leaving only half a slice of toast. He rested his hands on the table's edge, sitting up straight, staring at the empty plate as he planned the schedule for the herb garden in Cornwall. Orion had said that the local manager was prepared to receive them. Regulus would apparat there that afternoon. The flames in the fireplace suddenly leapt higher. Their color drained from orange-red to an inky green and shot up the chimney, spitting sparks that landed on the carpet and burned small charcoal marks. Orion folded his paper away. Walburga lifted her fork mid-air. Sirius stopped scraping his plate. Regulus's gaze sharpened, and his right hand dropped naturally, ready to grasp his wand. A figure stepped out of the fire, movement crisp and deliberate. The hem of her travel cloak still flicked with unconsumed green sparks. Her boots hit the carpet and kicked up a small puff of dust. Bellatrix Black. She had not yet taken her husband's name, and she knew the old house's private fireplace passage. It was a rude way to arrive. She stood steady and shook her head. Long dark curls fanned around her, a few strands plastered to her forehead. Her face showed the fatigue of a long journey, but her eyes were frighteningly bright, an intensity that verged on feverish excitement. "Bella!" Walburga sprang up, ignoring her napkin as it slipped to the floor. She opened her arms, voice ringing with surprise. "My child, how did you—" Bellatrix hugged her mother first, a quick, proper intimacy, then turned to Orion, the corners of her mouth lifting into something like a smile. "Uncle." Orion inclined his head once, saying nothing. His eyes caught a small, dark red smudge on the hem of Bellatrix's cloak, dried blood or potion residue, it was hard to tell. Sirius snorted and leaned back, the chair legs scraping the floor. He crossed his arms, face telling everyone exactly how unlucky he felt. Bellatrix did not look at him. From the moment she'd arrived, she hadn't spared Sirius a single glance, as if he were dirt underfoot. She walked straight to Regulus, coming close enough that he could smell the tang of smoke clinging to her. "Regulus," Bellatrix said. Her voice was hoarse but high, edged with excitement. "My dear cousin." Regulus looked up, surprised but polite. He did not rise, only shifted his posture to sit straighter, indicating he was listening. "Cousin." His tone had a faint warmth. "I did not expect you to come. Have you eaten? Shall I ask Creature?" "No," Bellatrix cut in. Her smile widened until it was eerie, the muscles at the corners of her eyes twitching. "I'm not here to eat." She slipped her hand inside her cloak with slow, almost reverential movements. The dining room fell into an expectant hush, broken only by the hearth's crackle. Orion braced his hands under the table. The object Bellatrix produced first looked for an instant like carved bone, a rectangular box, roughly the size of a man's palm, its surface furred with natural unevenness and intricate carving. Runes in an unfamiliar script crept across it. Their grooves were filled with a dark, golden lacquer that shimmered repulsively. The moment the box appeared, the room's temperature dropped. The fireplace flames shrank and ran dark. Several silver utensils along the table vibrated together, emitting a faint, high-frequency hum. Walburga gasped and clutched at her throat. Sirius went suddenly attentive, eyes fixed on the object. Orion's brow furrowed. Regulus's gaze lingered on the box before sweeping back to Bellatrix. He did not change his expression outwardly, but his magic sense reached out. The feedback was chaotic, soulful throes, broken and twisted, like countless voices screaming with their mouths clamped shut. The concentration of dark arts energy was abnormally high and focused, structured with at least 7 nested rings of protection. The core was completely shielded from detection. "The Dark Lord heard about what happened at Hogwarts," Bellatrix said. Her voice dropped, but every word seemed intended to provoke. "To preserve the dignity of the House of Black, to silence disharmony, he believes you show potential far beyond your years." She looked straight into Regulus's eyes. "And the proper inclination." Regulus said nothing, only tilted his head, listening. Bellatrix pushed the bone-colored box forward until it almost touched his chest. "This is the essence of knowledge he salvaged from ancient cursed ruins on his travels in his youth." She licked her lips. Her eyes shone dangerously bright. "This is a dark enlightenment." The dining room was quiet enough to hear Walburga's rapid breath. "Dark enlightenment?" Regulus repeated, cautious. "Cousin, I don't understand. It has no fixed incantations, no formal wand work," Bellatrix cut in, words spilling faster now. "It is a seed of dark magic. When you touch it, it will actively resonate with your soul, your memories, your power, and then it will show you a path." "A path?" Regulus echoed. "A path to true power," she whispered, hot breath on his face. "It will show you what is hidden by cowardly morality and petty common sense, how to turn pain into stronger magic, how to make curses pass through bloodlines, how to distill power out of despair." She watched his face closely. "Of course it demands a price. The weak-willed will be devoured, lost in illusions of strength, then driven to madness, or—" Bellatrix smiled, baring her teeth. "Wholly consumed by the dark, turned into a thing that only craves power. The Dark Lord said this gift is only for those who can look straight into the darkness and have the confidence to bring back strength from it." Her voice was thrilled with conviction. Regulus fell silent. He looked back down at the box, studying it more carefully. He could feel the box's magic pressing outward, coaxing him. He raised his eyes to Bellatrix. The expression on his young face was exactly what a boy on the precipice feels, part awe, part hesitation. "Cousin, thank you for the Dark Lord's great favor," he said slowly, with a trembling of uncertainty. "It's just that, with such a deep artifact, I worry my knowledge is not sufficient. To touch it rashly, if I do not know the correct method, I might squander this gift, or, through my ignorance, profane the Dark Lord's intentions." Bellatrix's smile tightened for a moment, then broke into a harsh laugh. Mockery glittered in her voice. "Afraid?" She leaned forward, the bone box nearly brushing Regulus's chin. "My dear Regulus, what do you fear? Power, or the Dark Lord's expectations of you?" Regulus leaned back slightly, unwilling to make contact, eyes dropping. I merely believe one should show proper reverence before such a precious gift. And awe? Bellatrix's voice rose, incredulous. The Dark Lord gives you the chance to touch true power, and you speak of awe? Regulus, Walburga snapped, no longer able to contain herself, voice shaking with excitement and something like urgency. Accept it. This is an honor. The Dark Lord thinks highly of you. 153, Chapter 151, Textbook Performance. Glory? Sirius shot up so fast his chair scraped across the floor. Look at what that thing is. That box is seeping dark energy. Bella, haven't you already ruined yourself for the Dark Lord? Do you have to drag Regulus down with you too? Bella swung her head toward him, voice ice cold. Shut up. A traitor has no right to speak here. Who are you to judge a gift from the Dark Lord? Regulus did not doubt that if they were anywhere but the House of Black, Bella would have hurled the vilest curses at Sirius. Sirius's face went red, his fists clenched. I'm trash? Then what are you? Voldemort's mad dog licking his heels. Enough. Orion's voice was quiet but absolute. He leaned both hands on the table and rose. His gaze swept Sirius, lingered on Bella, and finally landed on Regulus. Regulus kept his face down. He did not meet his father's eyes. He knew. The gift, Orion said steadily, without emotion. Regulus shall accept it. Walburga exhaled, relief softening her features into a smile. Sirius opened his mouth, but a look from Orion shut him down. He swallowed his retort, chest heaving. Bella turned back to Regulus, the fanatical smile returning. That's better. She nudged the 15 forward. Take it. Let the Dark Lord see that the heir of the House of Black is worthy. Regulus stared at the 15. Every eye in the dining room was fixed on him. Walburga's eager anticipation, Bella's coercive delight, Sirius's fury, Orion's silence. He ran through his options. Refusal was impossible. The House of Black did not refuse the Dark Lord. Bella was dangerous and unhinged. Killing her would not be hard, but her presence represented Voldemort's will. It could not be declined. Acceptance was the only path. How to accept, however, required care. What would the Dark Lord want to see? An heir seduced and corrupted by darkness? A pure-blood prodigy who masters it easily? Neither. He needed a middle ground. Shock, attraction, struggle, and a hesitant first mastery. A young 16 hand with obvious potential, yet still in control. Regulus raised his hand and touched the edge of the 15. His fingertips met a chill that marked negative energy aggregates. The runes flared the instant he touched them, shifting from dark gold to deep purple. The light didn't radiate outward, it drew inward, as if absorbing itself. He gripped the 15. Instantly, sound fell away, a detachment from the senses. Walburga's posture as she spoke, the widening grin on Bella's face, Orion's tightened pupils, Sirius's movement to lunge, each became a slow-motion mime, colors bleeding until only black, white, and gray outlines remained. The thing inside the 15 stirred. It crawled into his skin through the point of contact, but it had no body. It was not a thing but a living concept. Darkness, pain, temptation, madness, abstract terms made concrete. Viscous ink flowed into his veins. Countless voices whispered. Fragments of shattered visions detonated behind his eyes. He saw a field of ruin, a complex of exotic buildings beneath a blood-red sky, a city burning from an age he did not know. The air reeked of sulfur and the rot of great death, yet carried a strange, compelling perfume. A figure stood at the center, back turned, black robes billowing in the heat. The figure lifted a hand casually, buildings folded silently into black powder before they hit the ground. The collapse spread until the city was gone, leaving only a blanket of ash as far as sight could reach. Power. Pure, primal, unrestrained power. Its mere display was temptation. You could be like this. You could possess it. You could become a 16 who looks down on all life. The whispers sharpened. Pain is fuel. Fear is the best catalyst. Love, compassion, weaknesses, chains, obstacles to truth. Tear them apart, tear all restraints away, and see the real world. The visions shifted, tailoring themselves to him. He saw himself walking Hogwarts corridors, students gazing in awe or fear at his passing. He saw himself on a high platform with a crowd below, 16 muggles, familiar faces and strangers, cheering as his raised hand took command. Power again, sleeker now, tailored to the desires of a pure-blood heir. Regulus's core remained unmoved. Testing me with only this? Would anyone really break on such a thing? His core consciousness floated steady in the center of his mental world. Star orbit meditation ran at full strength. Orion's 4.5 stars burned with hot, even light against the dark. Each star anchored his core, holding it against the external visions and whispers. Occlumency activated as well. He constructed elaborate labyrinths at the edges of his mind, directing the dark energies and visions into pre-designed circuits. In an isolated cell of that maze, he placed a portion of his spirit to simulate a Regulus, a persona built to feel the hunger for power, to embrace pure-blood ideals and revere the Dark Lord. This simulated self, the Four saw the ruins in the black-robed figure. It heard the whispers and felt the temptation. Outside, in the dining room, Regulus's body responded. His hand trembled on the 15, fine beads of sweat rolled down his temples and pooled at his jaw. His breathing quickened, his chest rose and fell visibly. The eyes were the hardest piece to fake. He controlled his orbicularis oculi to twitch, letting his pupils blur and refocus, imitating the physiological signs of a mental onslaught. His lips parted, syllables slipping out in a broken, ancient tongue, fragments of knowledge deliberately leaked by dark enlightenment. Tath. The dining room was so silent, every murmur was plain. Bella's eyes glittered. She leaned forward, excitement and greed on her face. Walburga covered her mouth, fingers shaking. Whether with worry or hope, it was impossible to tell. Sirius had already scrambled to Regulus's side, but Orion held him back with a heavy hand on his shoulder. The pressure pinned Sirius in place. Orion's stare never left Regulus. He watched the performance with the attention of a veteran. As an older 16 who had endured real mental assaults in battle, Orion knew the signs. A true psychic invasion brought chaos, a loss of control, and physiological reactions in lockstep with inner torment. Regulus's act, however, looked too textbook. Shock, pain, struggle, all perfectly standard, like a demonstration from a manual on how a 16 reacts to a high-intensity dark arts artifact. Something was missing, the raw panic that catches one off guard, the instinctive resistance when consciousness is brutally violated, the uncontrolled 19 bleed from the violent clash of outside and host, 19. Regulus's magical fluctuations were unstable, but the pattern seemed contrived, faint, then strong, then easing, cycling again with unnerving regularity. Orion's fingers tightened on Sirius's shoulder. Sirius turned to look at his father. Orion only kept watching Regulus. Inside the Seven, the Four's confrontation reached a critical point. It could not defeat Dark Enlightenment outright. Doing so would be impossible and would not satisfy the Dark Lord. Instead, it compromised, guiding, taming, and limiting the external power. The FAF4 used its own dark inclinations as a bridge to form an unstable symbiosis. In a corner of the maze, it fashioned a cage, imprisoning the core of the Enlightenment. The cage was transparent. The dark 19 within still churned, whispered, and showed visions, but it was confined and could no longer assault the rest of the Four. At the same time, the Four gleaned things from the contact: how to convert negative emotion into magical output more efficiently, the simplified trigger logic of an ancient curse, and a handful of dark arts techniques, not earth-shattering, but real. Dark Enlightenment had baited him with knowledge. To obtain more required going deeper until there was no return. Regulus let the Four accept these tidbits, but did not fully absorb them. He stored them in the isolation cell for later study. His outward performance adjusted accordingly. The tremor in Regulus's hand eased, his breathing steadied. Sweat still tracked down his face and neck, and pallor lingered, but color returned to his cheeks. His grip on the slackened, no longer so fierce. Chapter 152. A Good Show. Regulus blinked. Tiny beads of sweat still clung to his eyelashes. His vision cleared. The dining room resolved itself around him, the long table, the hearth, and the figure standing before him. Bella's face was close, her eyes blazing with something like fanatic expectation. Regulus lowered his head and looked at his hands and the 15 they held. The runes along its surface had dimmed, reverting to a dull gold, but the oppressive aura lingered. He raised his eyes slowly to Bella. He looked exhausted. This was real. Sustaining that level of mental manipulation had taken a heavy toll. There was also a manufactured excitement about him, a cultivated hunger for power, and an unabashed awe. His voice was hoarse and tremulous when he spoke. "This is the Dark Lord's power?" Only the tip of the iceberg. Bella's lips spread into a grin. The tremor of excitement in her voice was unmistakable. You felt it, didn't you? True power, power unshackled by hypocritical morals. Regulus didn't answer at once. He glanced down at the 15 again, letting the feeling wash over him for a moment, then looked up and spoke, keeping his voice steady, though the shock still showed. Vast, he murmured, his gaze slightly unfocused. Profound. I saw things I never even considered. His words were quiet, almost a whisper, but every ear in the dining room heard them. Walburga exhaled in relief, a smile blooming as she clasped her hands to her chest. Sirius's face grew grim. He looked at his brother, tired, ecstatic, his hand gripping the fifth, and tried to speak. Regulus? Excellent. Bella cut him off with a sharp laugh, taking a step back and spreading her arms. Very good, Regulus, you did not disappoint the Dark Lord. She turned to Orion and Walburga, triumph plain on her face. Uncle, Aunt, you've seen it. The heir of the House of Black is worthy of this gift. Orion said nothing, only glanced at Bella before shifting his gaze to Regulus. Walburga hurried forward to embrace him, but he shifted aside, using the hand that held the 15 to fend her off. Mother, I'm drenched in sweat, he said flatly. Walburga paused, hand frozen in midair, then slapped his shoulder hard. My son, you have earned the Dark Lord's recognition. Glory for the House of Black. Sirius watched them all in silence for a beat, taking in his mother's ecstatic pride, Bella's self-satisfied posture, his father's inscrutable quiet, and Regulus's bowed head, still fixed on the 15. The sight, Regulus's profile lit by the morning light, struck him as bizarre. Lunatics, Sirius spat under his breath. All of you are lunatics. He turned and strode for the dining room door, yanked it open, and slammed it behind him. The noise left the room in stunned silence for a few seconds. Bella sneered, shaking her head as if to rid herself of something unpleasant, then refocused on Regulus with a suddenly formal tone. The gift is yours. The Dark Lord expects your further enlightenment. She put deliberate emphasis on the last word. Regulus gave a purposeful nod. I will study it carefully. Of course you must be careful. Bella's smile warped into that eerie expression once more. But remember, true power demands a resolute will to master it. Excessive protection can dull that resolve. Regulus met her gaze. Bella's eyes said plainly, I know you've been sheltering those two half-blood brats. What do you mean, cousin? He asked, his voice composed. The Dark Lord values decisiveness, Bella replied. Cut ties when it's time to cut ties. Make sacrifices when it's time to make sacrifices. A fuzzy stance benefits no one. Orion stepped between them, his eyes flicking first to the 15 in Regulus's hand, then back to Bella. Regulus has accepted the gift, and you have witnessed his demonstration. Send word to the Dark Lord that the House of Black thanks him for his favor. Bella fell silent. She turned toward the fireplace, the hem of her cloak brushing the carpet. Before she stepped into the flames, she glanced back at the 15 one last time. Use it well, she said. Don't waste it. Green fire flared and engulfed her figure for a heartbeat before the blaze died back to ordinary orange. When it faded, only 3 people remained in the dining room. Walburga was still fluttering with excitement, clutching Regulus's arm and babbling about the Dark Lord's favor, the bright future of the House of Black, and how Regulus must seize this chance. Regulus listened, nodding when necessary, his eyes drifting to Orion several times. His father remained by the table, hands braced on its edge, head bowed as if in thought. Since Bella's departure, Orion had not spoken another word, only Walburga's chatter filled the room. So you should make the most of your time. Walburga at last paused, patting the back of Regulus's hand. Start your research today. The Dark Lord will be eager to see progress. Walburga. Orion said the name once. It was quiet, but she fell silent instantly. He looked at his wife with a calm, steady gaze. Let Regulus go and rest. He looks exhausted. Walburga blinked and then, as if realizing herself, let go quickly. Yes. Oh, I was too excited. Reggie, go to your room, have a bath, and get a proper rest. There's no rush with the research. The Dark Lord will understand. Regulus inclined his head to her, and then to Orion. Their eyes met for a moment. Go on, Orion said. Get some rest. Regulus bowed his head and left, clutching the 15. He passed through the dining room doors into the dim corridor and ascended the spiral staircase. His footsteps echoed through the empty house. Once in his room, he shut and locked the door. He tossed the 15 carelessly onto his desk, sat down, and pressed his hands together on the desk's edge, closing his eyes. He began to think, carefully, analytically. First, the nature of the Dark Enlightenment. It was a composite magical artifact, concentrated dark knowledge woven with psychic contamination and spiritual temptation. It could bestow power, certainly, but its operating principle was corruption. By revealing the possibility of power and granting fragmentary visions and knowledge, it coaxed a user's deepest dark tendencies to the surface, nudging them toward moral decay. Second, Lord Voldemort's motive. This gift was a multi-layered test, a probe of Regulus's upper limits of talent, to see whether he could comprehend and withstand knowledge of this caliber, a test of loyalty, to measure his reaction and the purity of his intent. At a deeper level, it was an attempt to win him over with the subtlest poison, to let him seek power until he slipped into the path Voldemort desired. It was also a demonstration of condescending charity. The choice was placed before him, but refusal was not really an option. Acceptance was expected. Whether the recipient mastered the gift or was consumed by it became their own responsibility. Voldemort provided the opportunity. Failure showed unworthiness, and the consequences were the recipient's problem. Third, his performance. His outward reaction had to be convincing. Physical symptoms, layered emotional shifts. The awe and longing he displayed now fit a 12-year-old pure-blood heir thirsting for greatness. It would placate Bella and Walburga. Orion, however, must have seen through the act. He knew Regulus too well, knew the boy's habitual restraint and inner calm. A touch of tremulous excitement and exaggerated admiration might have been overplayed, but that was acceptable. In fact, it was deliberate. He wanted this tacit understanding between father and son. He hadn't meant to hide it from Orion. Better that his father saw through the performance. They would discuss things privately in the study later. Walburga only needed to see the surface, that her son had earned Voldemort's favor. Finally, Bella's warning about the protection on the Folda-2. Voldemort's circle had been watching. It wasn't an immediate crisis and didn't require direct attention. He only needed to ensure Alex reminded Lena Costa and Samuel Vance to keep low profiles. Outside, the sky had brightened. Sunlight began to cut through the clouds, casting shifting patches of light and shadow over Grimmauld Place. Muggle traffic noises drifted from the streets, and the milkman's cart wheels rattled on the pavement. Regulus rose and drew back the heavy curtains, looking out over a world stitched from magic and mundanity. Lord Voldemort was expanding his influence. Dumbledore was arranging his countermoves. Pure-blood families balanced on the edge of self-interest and allegiance. The Muggle world went on, blissfully unaware. He let the curtains fall, and the room sank back into shadow. Regulus began to undress for a bath. He had worked up a sweat, and the idea of washing felt necessary. Regulus stepped into the bathroom, turned the brass faucet, and let the steam blur the mirror. He stood under the flow, hot water sluicing over his head and down his face, eyes closed as it washed away sweat and fatigue. When he turned the tap off, the droplets on his skin vanished at once as if they had never been there. He slipped into a dark gray house robe, tied the belt, and returned to the bedroom. At the desk he sat, fingers tapping the wood as he considered the gift and the intent behind it. Magical inheritance in the wizarding world took many forms: books, oral transmission, memory sealing, even the Black family's crystals that passed down an ancestor's insights through touch. But this dark enlightenment was different. It spoke directly to the soul, showing what could be had if one followed the dark road. Cities collapsing in the palm of your hand, power roaring through your veins, the intoxicating taste of controlling other people's fates. It bypassed the work and fed the feeling of the result straight into the mind. Voldemort had been able to understand such things in his youth and had fashioned them into an artifact for others to experience. His talent was frightening, his power undeniable, his grasp of arcane matters already extraordinary. The danger that came with his gift was equally well-deserved. Compared to that, the House of Black's inheritance felt gentler and more purposeful. The natural magic inheritance, for example, taught how to guide external magic and perceive symbiotic relationships. What was sealed in its crystal was an ancestor's operational logic and insight, not an imposed mentality. The item in the bone box was different, chaotic, open-ended, with no set terminus. It offered possibilities and then showed the most alluring ones, coaxing you to leap in yourself. That made it far more sophisticated and far more insidious. Regulus leaned back and looked toward Grimmauld Place beyond the window. Voldemort claimed he'd given the gift because of Regulus's performance at Hogwarts. That might be true, but it smelled more like a probe. Any contact Regulus had with Dumbledore, even if concealed, could have left detectable traces. Or perhaps it was simply prophylactic, a suspicious leader casting a bait to see which way a promising heir would turn. For any pureblood who showed talent but had not yet wholly bent a knee, toss out a dose of poison and see whether they swallow it. A somewhat arrogant thought crossed Regulus's mind. Could Dumbledore and Voldemort be waging a quiet, long-distance contest using him as the arena? One offered gentle guidance, the other a corrupting gift. It was not impossible. Regulus's talent and position were sufficient to draw the attention of both. Dumbledore had made the first move, and Voldemort had followed. At their core, both were trying to influence him, shape his future, but their methods differed sharply. Voldemort's approach was blunt, domineering, and seductive. To most young purebloods who craved power and embraced the old blood ideals, dark enlightenment would seem like a divine boon. It would bind them, or at least make them yearn and respect. To Regulus, however, such a blatant offer felt like coercion. Follow my path and you gain power. Refuse and you are nothing. It revealed Voldemort's impatience and a growing willingness to crush old social rules underfoot. Bella's behavior today, entering the family home through the Flu network without notice, was a deliberate breach of pureblood etiquette. That she dared acted as proof that Voldemort and his inner circle had begun to scorn, even trample, traditional restraints. Their contempt for convention exposed an arrogance and a hunger to remake the order by force. Dumbledore's style contrasted sharply. He didn't force, he offered perspectives, introducing concepts like the magical blank space, not to dictate actions, but to widen a map of thought. He tipped resources through professors like McGonagall and Sprout without asking for repayment. Most importantly, he restored choice to Regulus. Dumbledore seemed less intent on recruiting a follower than on cultivating a future companion, a mind he could argue with. Perhaps that was another form of shaping, but it afforded dignity and room to think. He pulled back the curtain and watched sunlight finally break through the clouds. Grimmauld Place lay bright under the summer morning. A Muggle postman pedaled by with a basket of letters. An old woman watered flowers at her windowsill across the street. Regulus had accepted Voldemort's gift, but he would not be railroaded down a preordained road by it. The Dark Enlightenment offered intoxicating power and alluring mysteries of magic, but power itself is often a byproduct of strength, not its purpose. Regulus sought strength. Power might accompany it, but it was not the goal. Those arcane heights tempted him, but seeing a peak did not mean he would throw caution aside to scramble straight to the top. He believed that through research, accumulation, and careful exploration, he could reach, or even open, new summits, perhaps surpassing what the artifact promised. He might borrow help along the way, secret lore, family inheritances, or a nudge from a sympathetic professor, but only as tools under his control, never as masters. That clarity of limits mattered. The Enlightenment's power was real, but so were its limits. It functioned as an addictive mental narcotic and as a preordained dark path. Regulus had isolated its initial contamination, but continued contact would deepen it, twisting thought, emotion, and values. He could picture the endgame, someone hooked on the immediate pleasure and domination of dark power, growing colder and more extreme, coming to see Voldemort as the sole embodiment of truth and willingly becoming a fanatic. The virtual personality he had constructed had weathered the first wave. What then if the contamination increased? If one measure wasn't enough, more could be introduced. He stopped and considered. He'd only created the consciousness room yesterday and was still deciding how to use it. Perhaps he could turn it into a containment chamber. Let the simulated personality live inside, keep the contamination away from his main self, and introduce the enclosed core of the Enlightenment there in a controlled way. The simulated mind could study it, attempt to use it, and learn, while the main consciousness remained insulated. That would let him gain knowledge while confining the corruption to a cage and probing the dark power's properties and limits. There were constraints. He couldn't build infinite rooms, and maintaining a simulated personality required constant mental input. That depended on the strength of his soul and the total and recovery rate of his mental reserves. Star orbit meditation was the foundation for both. Building and maintaining a fully functional containment room and a reasonably complex simulated mind was probably his upper safety limit. Any more would risk clouding his main consciousness and degrading his daily control of magic. He could also set traps at the room's periphery, lures for any mind that tried to intrude without permission, whether a legilimens or a direct mental assault like the Dark Enlightenment. Before reaching his real mind, intruders would be funneled into a space saturated with contamination and populated by simulated personalities, a mental minefield capable of poisoning or even turning on the intruder. It was a new kind of mental defense, a practical step born of thought rather than words. Action, Regulus decided, would speak far louder than counsel. Chapter 154. The Tacit Understanding Between Father and Son. Regulus walked to the bedside, sat cross-legged, closed his eyes, and slowed his breathing. He sank into the depths of his consciousness. In his inner world, starlight spread across the mental space, forming a three-dimensional constellation that rotated slowly. Star orbit meditation provided a pure spirit and a stable framework. Now he would rebuild the mental room. He remodeled the simple isolation chamber into a more complex composite construct using advanced occlumency. First, he wove a filtration layer. Relying on the pure principles of star orbit meditation, he spun a dense net of spirit so that all magical information entering the room would first pass through this filter. Its purpose was not to erase, but to tag, analyze, and log. Then he opened an observation window, a one-way pane of translucent spirit through which his main consciousness could watch the interior without the things inside detecting his gaze. Next came a magic conduit, a slender, adjustable channel linking the room to the outside, its interior carved with restrictive runes to regulate flow rate, volume, and magical purity. Finally, he built internal solid defenses. On the inner walls, he layered protective nets of spirit to prevent the virtual personality or any imported dark arts from escaping. These nets were directly tied to Regulus's core consciousness. Any abnormal breakthrough attempt would trigger alarms and could even auto-initiate a destruction protocol. The whole construct functioned as both a containment cell and a laboratory. He summoned the virtual personality he had used at breakfast, the power-hungry Regulus, and began adjusting its traits. He weakened its other emotional modules and stripped away self-awareness and identity. He amplified its obsessive drive to research the dark arts, increased its curiosity and appetite for experimentation, and implanted a low-level command. All research outcomes must be reported through the filtration layer. When the adjustments were complete, he locked the virtual persona into the containment cell. It stood in the center of a pure white hexahedral room with the eager, greedy expression Regulus had tuned for it. It did not know it was caged. It believed it occupied a private research space. Regulus eased the conduit open and linked it to the Dark Enlightenment core, transmitting information and magical energy into the cell. The virtual persona reacted at once. It turned toward the conduit, eyes bright, reaching out as if to feel the arcane currents diffusing through the room. It began to study, pacing, fingers tracing patterns in the air, lips moving in silent fragments of ancient spells leaked from the Dark Enlightenment. It paused, frowned as if puzzling out a formula, then continued. The filtration layer recorded and analyzed everything in real time. Regulus set strict safety rules. His main consciousness retained ultimate authority, able at any moment to cut off magical input, close the observation window, or tweak filtering parameters. If necessary, he could trigger the destruction protocol, compress the entire containment cell and its contents, and annihilate them. It would cost some portion of his spirit, but it guaranteed absolute safety. The virtual personality's activities were strictly confined. It could not perceive beyond the room or communicate directly with his main consciousness. Any research results or acquired dark arts had to pass the filtration layer's review before being selectively relayed. The filter worked on two principles. The purity of star orbit meditation would automatically screen out information with strong mental contamination or emotional distortion, and Regulus's own understanding of magic would distinguish between genuine knowledge and traps masked as insight. 3 hours later, he opened his eyes. The bedroom was dim. The curtains were still drawn. The clock on the bedside table read 1:17 p.m. He had forged a sustainable, safe platform for studying the dark arts, a way to extract purified knowledge while containing mental contamination and personality corruption within an isolation zone. In effect, he had turned the poison sent by Lord Voldemort into a controllable sample library and test server. The disadvantage had been transformed into an advantage. Regulus rose, stretched his stiff wrists and neck from the long meditation, and opened the wardrobe. He took out a dark green formal robe, thickly woven, cut to fit, the collar and cuffs embroidered with the House of Black crest. He buttoned it up and adjusted the collar. In the mirror, he looked like the same boy, his eyes clear, though his face was a little pale from the exertion. He needed to speak with his father. The house was quiet as he descended the spiral staircase. Passing the dining room, he glanced in. The long table had been cleaned, and the fireplace burned as if the earlier display had never happened. At the study door, he knocked 3 times with his knuckles. From inside came Orion's voice. "Come in." He entered. Orion sat behind the large desk with several documents spread before him, quill in hand. The ink on the nearest parchment had almost dried. "Father," Regulus said, and took the high-backed chair opposite. Orion set the quill down and leaned back. "How do you feel?" he asked. "I'm fine," Regulus replied steadily. "The dark enlightenment has been dealt with." Orion said nothing, only watched him with evident concern. Regulus gathered his thoughts. It is essentially a highly concentrated dark arts entity with strong mental induction and contamination. It erodes anyone who contacts it by displaying power and spreading twisted doctrine. Orion's face remained composed. He tapped his fingers lightly on the armrest, giving his son space to continue. "It showed me paths of power rooted in pain and domination and the illusions that follow," Regulus went on. "It's tempting, but the path is preset. The price is giving yourself up entirely, accepting the darkness, even merging with it." Orion nodded minutely. Regulus shifted in his chair. "I used occlumency and some mental techniques to build a safe isolation zone inside my consciousness. I've confined its influence there. I can study its knowledge indirectly without contaminating my soul. So it's like a dangerous specimen locked in a cage," he summarized. "I can pry useful information from it as research material." Orion listened quietly, eyes appraising. Regulus spoke calmly throughout, composed and clear, a very different figure from the shocked, rapt young man from earlier that morning. The initial worry on Orion's face gradually softened, replaced by a look of approval. He understood his son. This cool-headed, methodical approach was Regulus at his core. "By accepting this gift," Regulus said finally, "we've gained some initial trust from Lord Voldemort's side, buying us a more relaxed observation period. Long-term," he added, "it means he'll watch me more closely, and the risks are deeper." Orion's fingers stopped tapping. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, hands clasped. His voice dropped a little. "Your mother, she was very agitated today." He knew Walburga's temperament and persistence, and he knew that would put extra pressure on Regulus. As a father, he could not change his wife's nature. He could only warn his son to be careful. Regulus's expression did not flicker, as if he had expected this. "I understand," he said simply. Walburga's love and paranoia were two sides of the same coin. There was no point in getting upset over what could not be changed. Handling his own affairs was the priority. They let the matter rest. Everything that needed to be said had been said without further words, another form of tacit understanding. Regarding those parts of the family that could not be altered, remain clear-headed, keep a measured distance, and preserve the outward harmony. Lestrange Manor, on the outskirts of Oxfordshire, still looked gloomy under the 10 o'clock morning sun. Built in a stern French stone masonry style, with cold, hard lines and narrow, high windows, its thick walls shut out the warmth of the countryside. Even by day, the interior needed extensive light. Candles burned on silver candelabra, and enchanted flames leapt in the hearths, yet the light always seemed to be swallowed by something invisible, failing to lift the shadows in the corners. Servants in dark, formal livery moved silently along long corridors laid with Persian rugs. House elves were rarely seen, materializing only when a candelabra needed replacing or a grate required cleaning, then vanishing as soon as the task was done. Dark green flames flared in a secondary fireplace in the corner of the drawing room as Bellatrix stepped out, her footsteps heavy on the carpet. The feverish excitement on her face had not yet faded. Her eyes glittered, and a strange smile lingered at the corners of her mouth. She did not go looking for Rodolphus right away, instead turning to climb the stairs. Her bedroom lay in the east wing at the end of the corridor. Pushing the door open, she found a large, ostentatiously furnished chamber with a carved four-poster bed and silk hangings. Several eerie, unsettling magical portraits hung on the walls, and glass cases displayed artifacts of the dark arts that seemed dangerous to the touch. Bellatrix shrugged off her cloak and flung it onto the foot of the bed, then drew a deep purple day gown from the wardrobe to change into. This was the Lestrange household. She had to report briefly to Rodolphus before she sought the person who truly mattered to her. Leaving the room, she retraced her steps down the long corridor. As she approached the family council chamber, she met someone emerging from the library, Rodolphus Lestrange. Rodolphus was more than a head taller than Bellatrix, broad-shouldered and grave in dark gray robes whose cut and color seemed old-fashioned and austere. His eyes were deep-set beneath high cheekbones. His thin lips were set in a hard line, and his expression was severe, his gaze cold. He glanced at Bellatrix without pausing and continued toward the council chamber. His voice was low and flat. "Is the matter settled?" Bellatrix tipped her chin up, wearing the triumphant look of one who has just completed a mission. "Of course," she said, affectingly light. The Dark Lord's gift, Regulus Black, accepted it gladly. His reaction was excellent. To Bellatrix, Regulus's performance had not just met expectations, it had possibly exceeded them. For a 12-year-old facing the dark enlightenment for the first time to remain steady and to take something from the encounter, such talent deserved praise. More importantly, it proved her mission had been executed flawlessly. A flawlessly executed mission would draw the Dark Lord's attention toward her more often. Bellatrix felt nothing for Rodolphus beyond the political convenience of their marriage. A daughter of the House of Black marrying the eldest Lestrange son would bind two ancient lines, exchange influence, and help preserve blood purity. She had long known what Rodolphus was: cold, rigid, loyal to family advantage and pure-blood ideology above all else. He could show no warmth to his wife. He expected only that she perform the duties of Mrs. Lestrange, social obligations, producing heirs, and acting as a bridge between the Lestranges and the Blacks when required. He married her for her name, her lineage, and her standing with Lord Voldemort. Her private eccentricities meant nothing to him so long as she did not jeopardize Lestrange interests. What kept Rodolphus from openly despising her was her surname and the status it conferred. The name Black carried more weight in pure-blood circles than Lestrange. More Wizengamot members, more high ministry officials, broader industrial reach and social connections. And Bellatrix's position at Voldemort's side, as one of his most devoted followers, gave her direct access and the opportunity to carry out important missions. That delivered a kind of immunity inside the Lestrange house. Rodolphus could be cold, but he could not afford to scorn someone the Dark Lord favored. Now Regulus had attracted the Dark Lord's attention. That increased the House of Black's standing in Voldemort's camp, and as a Black daughter, Bellatrix's own status rose with it. Her pointed praise of Regulus was a reminder to Rodolphus. "See, our house has produced someone the Dark Lord values. You would be wise to treat me well." A slight curl at one corner of Rodolphus's mouth was the only reply. So slight it was hard to read, mockery, disdain, or something else. His eyes studied Bellatrix. "How did Orion take it?" Bellatrix laughed, a small, scornful sound. "How else would he react?" she said, then mimicked Orion Black's composed, barely repressive tone. "The House of Black thanks him for his regard. Gracious on the surface, but inside, he's probably seething." Rodolphus emitted a non-committal grunt. "The Dark Lord is waiting for your report in the study," he said, and without looking back, he turned and walked away. Bellatrix watched his back disappear around the corner and curled her lip. Neither of them pretended to like the other. They both knew what the other was and spared one another the performance of courtesy. She smoothed her collar, inhaled deeply, set her face into one of piety and trembling excitement, and made her way to the study that Voldemort had taken over, a small building deeper in the grounds. Portraits lined the corridor. Lestrange ancestors watched her with somber expressions. The portrait of Rodolphus Lestrange, a 19th-century minister for magic, glared with particular hostility. Leda Lestrange's portrait followed Bellatrix with a look of sorrow before turning away. At the corridor's end, a heavy oak door stood shut, its surface bare save for a polished brass handle. Bellatrix knocked 3 times. A voice answered from within. "Enter." The study was modest, furnished simply with a heavy dark desk and a tall back chair. The only light came from a magical lamp on the desk, whose shade was of some translucent, bone-like substance that cast a ghastly white glow. That light threw Voldemort's silhouette across the stone wall behind him. The shadow's edges blurred and shivered as if alive. He sat in the high-backed chair, his back to the door, facing a barred window. Bellatrix stopped 3 paces from the desk, pressed her right hand over her heart, and bowed deeply, the gesture ritualized and deliberate. "My master," Voldemort turned slowly. By 1973, his appearance had already shifted from Tom Riddle into something inhuman, though not yet the full snake-like form he would later take. He retained a human outline, tall, slender, broad-shouldered, but his skin was waxen and pallid, streaked with faint, twisted veins. His nose had lost its human bridge and become little more than 2 narrow slits. His lips were thin and dark purple, almost black where they met his skin. Most arresting were his eyes, the irises a bloodshot, violent red, and the pupils narrowed to thin, vertical slits. His hair remained thick and combed back, near inky black. He wore a floor-length black velvet cloak, plain except for an almost invisible Slytherin serpent embroidered in silver at the collar. A chill, sharp and oppressive, hung about him. Even when he did not cast spells, the temperature in the room seemed several degrees lower. Wisps of dark mist drifted through the air, an outward sign of leaking magical power. An open book lay on the desk. Its cover was an odd, dull, yellowish-brown, pitted with pores and marked by the wrinkled textures of something that had once been alive, human skin. Voldemort's long, pale fingers rested on the edge of the page. His nails were hard, sharp. He raised those red eyes and fixed them on Bellatrix. Under that gaze, that indifferent, malign pressure, Bellatrix trembled. Her face flushed. She looked as though intoxicated. Standing before him, she felt as if she might fly. Chapter 156, Voldemort, I'm watching you. Bella, Lord Voldemort's voice was flat, neither high nor low, utterly devoid of feeling. How did it go? Bella straightened but remained slightly bowed, the posture of a devoted servant. She launched into her report, speaking quickly, excitement sharpening her tone as her hands fluttered in emphasis. Master, the moment he touched the Enlightenment, it was like his whole being was pulled into it. Her eyes glittered as if she were replaying the scene in the dining room. I was right there watching. His body jerked, his eyes went unfocused, and sweat ran down his forehead. But he didn't collapse, didn't scream. He just stood there, stunned. She took a small step forward, making the next point as if it were proof. And I saw it, Master. Pain and struggle on his face, but more than that, shock and greed. He was completely mesmerized by what was inside. Lord Voldemort listened in silence, his red eyes fixed on Bella's face, piercing as though trying to rebuild the scene through her. Bella grew more fervent. The key is this. He steadied himself. On his very first contact, he steadied. It took a little time, 10 minutes maybe. He went pale, gasping, but he said himself. She cleared her throat and dropped her voice, mimicking Regulus's deliberately calm but slightly shaking baritone. Is this the power of the Dark Lord? Vast, profound, awe-inspiring. She laughed softly after the imitation. He even muttered some ancient syllables unconsciously. I couldn't understand them, but they must have come from inside the Enlightenment. Master, he has a preliminary understanding already and is trying to tame it. His talent may be greater than we thought. Voldemort's finger tapped the edge of a book page. And Orion. His voice remained blank. What was his attitude? Bella curled her lip with undisguised contempt. Orion put on his usual sanctimonious air, offering platitudes about how the House of Black appreciates your favor. Walburga was nearly beside herself, crying and laughing and clutching at Regulus. As for that traitor Sirius, she snorted coldly and said no more. She inhaled, and a smug, pious smile crossed her face. Master, I believe Regulus Black understands the weight of what you have given him. He's begun down the path we hoped for. His thirst for power is real. He longs for the greatness you showed him. She looked at Voldemort, waiting for praise. He was quiet a moment, his red eyes narrowing like a serpent's. Then he asked, voice low and cold, when he touched the Enlightenment, how did his magic react? Was it a violent struggle, or did his magic accept it? Bella blinked, surprised. She had been focused on Regulus's expression and physical reaction. She hadn't paid attention to magical fluctuations. She strained to remember. There had been some change, but not violent, more like acceptance. It seemed to accept it, she said uncertainly. Not violent, quite steady. Voldemort didn't comment on the shaky answer. He pressed on. At the end, did Regulus ask about the Enlightenment, how to control it, the risks? Did he seem inclined to make his own decisions instead of waiting to be told? Bella shook her head. No, he only showed shock and awe, then remained lost in that state. He didn't ask anything else. Voldemort fell silent, then colder than before. I will see for myself. The words landed and something tore into Bella's mind. It was not gentle. It was a violent, intrusive force. Pain exploded behind her eyes and radiated through her nerves to the lining of her skull. Her eyeballs felt as if they would burst from the pressure. Her body convulsed, her knees weakening. She nearly collapsed, fingers clawing at her robes. Breath came in short, ragged gasps. A whimper slipped from her throat. At the same time, another sensation rose, being invaded, explored, completely controlled by her master. That knowledge, that violation, electrified her blood like a potent draught. Pain and pleasure slammed into each other at her nerve endings, and her body twitched. Her cheeks flushed, eyes half closed, lips parting with broken breaths. Voldemort sifted through her memories, concentrating on that brief morning in the Grimmauld Place dining room. The playback was sharper and more seamless than recall alone, but the method of viewing was harsh. He watched Bella step out of the hearth, Walburga's embrace, Orion's furrowed brow, Sirius's look of disgust. He watched Regulus set down his cutlery, wipe his mouth with a napkin, and look up at Bella politely, inquisitive. He saw the Enlightenment brought out, the temperature drop in the room, the cutlery begin to vibrate. He saw Regulus reach out, touch the edge of the artifact. His whole body jerked, and his eyes went blank. Then came the most crucial minutes. The 10 minutes between contact and when Regulus opened his eyes. Voldemort used Bella's point of view to examine details she had ignored or failed to understand. As a master of legilimency, he could penetrate most wizards' mental defenses and read the depths of their memories, but legilimency only reveals what's stored in the memory. It cannot conjure sensations that were never perceived. Magical fluctuations are instantaneous phenomena, not images. If Bella hadn't perceived them, Voldemort could not see them through her. Yet Regulus's behavior after he opened his eyes revealed a detail Bella had missed, something Orion himself might have noticed. Voldemort withdrew his legilimency. The assault on Bella's mind ended suddenly, and she went limp, collapsing to the floor. She panted against her hand, still trembling. The flush on her cheeks had not faded, and her eyes were hazy, as if she'd endured extreme strain. Voldemort ignored her gasps and leaned back in his chair, considering what he'd seen. That Regulus steadied himself upon first contact, finding some measure of composure within minutes and even gaining insight, was extraordinary. He had not been broken, nor had he been driven mad. This meant Regulus Black had the potential to become a powerful wizard. His soul strength and mental resilience far outstripped his peers. That made him valuable. But the reaction was suspiciously textbook. For a 12-year-old, bred by Orion and Walburga, known for being unnervingly calm and mature, his performance was almost too perfect. It was as if he knew what the onlookers expected and then delivered it. And Orion's silence, was it inability to object or a deliberate, calculating indulgence? Orion was no fool. His son was likely more unusual than he appeared. It didn't change the larger truth. Corruption by the dark enlightenment is gradual and insidious. The first display could be a facade, a mental defense, or a carefully staged performance. But what about the 10th time, or the 100th? Each encounter with that power, each lick of forbidden knowledge, would reshape perception, erode the soul, and let poisonous whispers into the spirit. Once he began to rely on the dark arts to solve problems, to draw strength from pain and domination, he would taste the thrill of superiority. Turning back would become hard, perhaps impossible. For now, this was a preliminary success. Voldemort marked Regulus as a high-value candidate for cultivation, one to be watched and influenced continuously. He turned his gaze back to Bella, who was pushing herself upright, still flushed and trembling, eyes wet with reverent expectation. "You have done well, Bella," he said in his usual level tone. "Regulus Black shows promise." The simple praise sent another tremor through her. A brilliant, twisted smile split her face. "To serve my master is my honor," she whispered, voice quivering with fervor. "Continue to watch him," Voldemort added. Bella nodded vigorously. "Yes, master, I will keep constant watch." His tone shifted. "And watch Orion Black's movements, as well as Hogwarts. See whether eyes that should not be watching are turning toward the boy." Hearing Hogwarts and Dumbledore named snapped her to a new vigilance. "Yes, my master," she said, eager. "I'll keep my eyes everywhere." Voldemort waved her away. Bella bowed deeply and left, her steps still a little unsteady. Quiet settled over the study again. Voldemort leaned back and looked out at the barren garden, thinking. Regulus Black, an interesting child. Was he the heir into whom the House of Black was pouring everything in preparation for the coming upheavals? A trap set by Dumbledore? Or simply a gifted pureblood boy hungry for power? It didn't matter which. He had accepted the gift. The power it offered was real, and the path to strength lay plainly before him. As long as Regulus retained even a spark of desire for power, he would eventually walk the road Voldemort had mapped out. Whether he walked it willingly or was pushed along the way was the only difference. Sirius Black stopped talking. Since that breakfast, he hadn't made any deliberate noise. No more scraping his plate with his fork. No more donning that black t-shirt with the Muggle band to rile Walburga. No more barbed replies of, "What's so great about pure bloods?" whenever she praised noble lines. He simply appeared at the table on time, ate on time, and left on time. Like a volcano that had suddenly gone dormant, only the silent mountain remained. Walburga showed no visible reaction. If anything, she looked pleased. Regulus read entitlement in her eyes, as if everything was finally as it should be. Orion, too, said nothing. He kept himself busy with household matters and business outside the home. Regulus knew what Sirius was thinking. He watched those gray eyes, once full of burning anger, cool down bit by bit, from blazing flame to embers, from embers to cold ash. Sirius didn't understand what had happened that day. It wasn't a matter of intelligence. There was nothing wrong with his brain. The problem was the way his mind worked. When Sirius saw Bella step out of the fireplace with the 23, heard her say it was a gift from 9, and felt the ominous aura around the box, his single, instinctive reaction was, evil. Evil must be rejected. His way of rejecting it was to curse, to flip the table, to smash the box and throw it back in Bella's face. He felt entirely justified. Sirius's logic was blunt and simple. Lord Voldemort is evil, and an evil man's things are evil, so why accept them? Refuse, and you have won. He never considered what would come after refusal. Regulus imagined asking him then, what would have happened if I had refused? Sirius would probably have lifted his chin, curled a disdainful smile, and said, what could happen? Could Bella have killed you on the spot? That was how Sirius thought. As long as he stood on the right side, what he did matched his sense of justice, then consequences either didn't exist or didn't belong to him. If they did appear, they were the world's fault, not his. At 11 and 12, this could be called naive. At 14, it was simply infuriating. He never once asked what Bella's words, a gift from 9, meant in the current wizarding world. For Lord Voldemort to take a personal interest in a pureblood heir was a mark. That person had been noticed, brought into his sight. To refuse the gift was to refuse Lord Voldemort, and refusing him required paying a price. Could the House of Black afford that price? Voldemort's influence already reached into the ministry. His followers were embedded across the four. His power had been proven repeatedly. A refusal could cost property, lives, or leave the family harried and boycotted until they submitted or were destroyed. None of this occurred to Sirius. Regulus didn't think his brother was stupid, just simple. Simple in a way that was enviable and also hopeless. Orion said nothing, but Regulus knew what his father's look meant. This eldest son could no longer remain in the House of Black. Maybe not immediately, but soon. Orion had given up trying to teach Sirius the survival logic of the Four. Some things could not be taught. No matter how patiently he explained, Sirius would hear only, "You're brainwashing me again." When a person labels every attempt to explain reality as control, meaningful dialogue ends. So Orion chose silence. Regulus knew that day wasn't far off. Sirius would run away at 16, break with the family, and have his name burned from the tapestry by Walburga. Perhaps, because of Regulus, that timetable would shift forward a little. That prospect was not unwelcome. Sirius leaving the house would be better for everyone. Sirius's path had long since been fixed. When dinner ended, Regulus went upstairs and opened his bedroom door. He went to his desk, pulled open the drawer, and took out the rune box. Orion had brought it home that day. It was an old object kept in the family's hidden vault for years, with at least 4 layers of nested 6 carved inside and out. The 23 lay inside, isolated from all contact with the outside world. On a rational level, Regulus felt no anger. Anger needs expectations. Expectations that someone will respect you, that things will be fair, that the world follows rules of justice. Regulus had long since stopped expecting any of that. Voldemort's tests, his attempts to court or corrupt, were within his predictions. When he sent this gift, he clearly hadn't considered Regulus's feelings. Regulus wasn't angry. He was merely confirmed in what he already believed. Voldemort was exactly as he thought, irreconcilable with him. That confirmation was not defeat. Now it could be addressed. He filed the incident away as a debt to be repaid in time. Since you treat me like this, you will have to answer for it later. He closed the drawer and walked to the window. Grimmauld Place was very quiet at night. Most residents on the street were elderly, children didn't play after dark, and the lamps were dimmer than on adjacent streets. Regulus closed his eyes and checked the status of the 18. The 7 was still active. For the past few days he had done little else: eat, sleep, practice in small amounts, and watch it. It had been studying dark enlightenment for nearly 60 hours, sustained by Regulus's periodic recharges. The results were significant. Dark fragments, filtered, were being organized and cataloged. The taint remained locked in the isolation zone. Through the observation window, Regulus saw the 7 standing in the center of the room. Its 27 fathom fluctuations were noticeably more subdued than a few days before, the edges carrying that corrosive shadow unique to 23. It was unaware of this. It only felt it was researching something fascinating. The system could keep running for another day or two, but at this intensity he might have to interact with it again before school started, or it would run out of food. He glanced at the clock. 9:47 p.m. Tomorrow, Cornwall. Delayed by Voldemort for nearly a week, it was time to get the plan back on track. The early morning in Cornwall smelled of sea salt. Regulus apparated to a marked clearing on the outskirts of the 21. The mist had not yet burned off. The air was damp and heavy. In the distance, the glass roofs of several greenhouses showed dimly through the haze. "Mr. Black," a voice came from behind him. He turned, and a short 25 had already approached. Agnes. Barely even to his shoulder, she had a sturdy build and skin tanned to a deep wheat color. A few light brown sunspots freckled her cheekbones and the bridge of her nose. Her ash-brown hair was cropped short and tucked behind her ears, a few damp strands clinging to her face. She wore a hard-wearing coarse cloth gown and an old leather apron, its surface dark with water and mud and speckled with a few small scorched holes. Her fingers were thick, the joints knobby, nails cut short, traces of soil and plant juices clung in the creases. Regulus had seen similar hands at Hogwarts. Professor Sprout's hands came back from the greenhouses with the same mud under the nails. People who worked with magical plants shared a certain temperament. "Agnes," Regulus nodded. "Sorry to disturb you so early." "Not at all. I've been up since 5. Agnes waved the interruption away. "Watering starts at 6 in the greenhouses. The mist lifts around now and the light is best. Come on in. The main house is to the east. I've prepared the top floor room for you. It faces southeast, so you can see the sea in the morning." She turned and led him along the dirt path, walking with a brisk, nearly silent step. Her apron pockets bulged. After a few strides, a leather glove slipped from one and tumbled to the ground. She bent, scooped it up, and tucked it back in with a smooth, practiced motion. Chapter 158. Practicing Magic Costs Money. Regulus followed behind without making any small talk. He had met Agnes once last year while inspecting the estate. Back then, he had only viewed the herb garden from a distance and listened to the foreman report on the harvest and the gnome's mischief. He had not really spoken with her. Agnes, however, remembered him clearly. Her manner was warm but not fawning, an air of propriety that only someone who had served the family for decades could possess. The main house was a 2-story stone building, its outer walls half hidden by climbing ivy. Agnes pushed the door open. The entryway was cluttered with clay pots of all sizes, some holding recovering cuttings, others empty, soil still clinging damply to their drainage holes. "The upstairs is tidy, the downstairs is a mess. Don't mind it," she said as she mounted the stairs. The room on the upper floor was small, but tastefully arranged. The east window looked toward the distant coastline. Morning mist was lifting, and a strip of pale gold marked where the gray-blue sea met the horizon. Below the south window, the greenhouse complex spread out, a continuous line of glass roofs. "This room is the quietest. There's no noise at night," Agnes said, pushing the window open and letting the damp sea breeze rush in. "If you need anything, call for me. Mr. Black wrote that you are mainly here to study mandrakes this time?" 20 mature ones," Regulus replied, setting his luggage on the low cabinet beside the bed. "I need an isolated greenhouse that no one else will enter." Agnes did not ask any more questions. She simply nodded. "A separate greenhouse, number 3 on the east side, is empty. It was cleared out last month. The sunlight and humidity suit them. 20 mature plants." She paused, gazing briefly into the distance as if taking stock. "That should do. It can be ready by lunchtime." Regulus nodded. She still wore that calm expression. "Rest for a while, Mr. Black. I'll bring the key to greenhouse 3 before lunch." She turned and went downstairs. Her footsteps faded away around the stairwell. Regulus stood by the window, looking out at the row of greenhouses. Mandrakes were not cheap. He had looked through procurement records. A mature mandrake sold for about 120 to 150 galleons each. 20 of them would be roughly 3,000 galleons. Their value, however, was not only financial. In the wizarding world, they were indispensable for healing. A mature mandrake root was the only ingredient for a mandrake restorative draught, the ultimate cure for petrification, unmatched and irreplaceable. Roots brewed into potent restorative tonics were the first choice for treating the mental damage left by a Dementor's kiss. Leaf extracts could neutralize various lingering curses, and in the language of ancient runes, dried mandrake root ground into powder was even a necessary medium for certain high-level protective 9. Their scarcity stemmed from how difficult they were to cultivate. A mandrake's growth divides into 3 stages: infancy, adolescence, and maturity. Only at maturity could it be used medicinally, and each stage had particular requirements. Infants required dragon dung fertilizer. Adolescents demanded measures to prevent them from interfering with one another. At harvest time, specialized earmuffs were necessary. Any mistake could kill the plant or injure the harvester. The humanoid roots possessed quasi-sentient traits. Infant roots looked like crying babies. Juveniles behaved like moody adolescents, throwing parties and climbing into one another's pots. Those traits added to their symbolic and collectible value. Families of pure blood and apothecaries were willing to pay a premium for a reliable supply of mature mandrakes. 10 minutes before lunch, Agnes knocked and brought the key. It was brass, with a complex set of teeth, heavy in his hand. Regulus took it, thanked her, and did not hurry out. He ate lunch in the main house dining room, drank a full glass of pumpkin juice, and waited until the sun had warmed to the soft gold of afternoon before going. Greenhouse number 3 sat on the far east side of the complex, isolated and shielded by a low stone wall. Runes to repel gnomes and burrowing pests were etched faintly along the wall. Regulus used the key to open the door, and as a precaution, put on protective earmuffs at the threshold. Inside the light was dimmer. The glass roof had been treated for shading, allowing only about 60% transmission. The flagstone path underfoot was slightly damp. Planting troughs lined both sides, filled with specially prepared dark brown soil. 20 mandrakes sat quietly in their pots. Each plant stood roughly a foot tall, broad, dark green leaves with fine serrated edges, and the top of the roots exposed on the soil like the rounded shoulders of a toddler, an unsettling, almost human outline. Regulus crouched at the first trough, his eye level with one plant. He reached out, palm hovering 3 inches above the leaves. His magic perception unfurled, and his 9 condensed into fine threads, establishing a connection with the mandrake. The feedback was complex. The mandrake's magical circulation was a network, multiple entrances and exits, interweaving like the root system of a great tree. Touch one tendril, and it linked elsewhere, to a main trunk that led down to even deeper parts. He withdrew his hand and did not attempt extraction. He closed his eyes and, instead of probing for information, simply listened. He wanted to feel its life, the flow of 9 through leaf veins, and the core deep in the root, the fundamental source of what made a mandrake a mandrake. Regulus sat before that plant through the entire afternoon. His palm hovered, his magical tendrils reached in, were rebuffed, probed again, and repelled again. The mandrake's quasi-biological instincts caused it to resist foreign 9. "I don't know you. I'm not used to you. I don't want you touching my core," its nature seemed to say. The first day ended without result. Dinner arrived. Agnes had placed it on the small wooden table at the greenhouse entrance, and by the time he noticed, the soup had gone cold. He drank the cold vegetable broth, ate 2 slices of coarse black bread, and resumed his vigil. Early the next morning, his eyes opened with his magic perception still extended. The plant seemed to have grown accustomed to him. Regulus used natural 9 to establish something like a symbiosis and began to guide rather than force. The mandrake's 9 loosened and slowly flowed out along the magical channel he had constructed. He let that little droplet of condensed pass through his palm, feeling its texture, properties, and inclinations. He had known decomposition in the ordinary sense, weathering and erosion, wood turning to soil, iron rusting. But the mandrake's form of decomposition was different. He imagined a feather, pristine and whole. As the 9 flowed, the feather did not burn or shatter, nor did it turn to powder. It simply lost the definition of feather. The rachis, barbs, and filaments remained, but they no longer formed a cohesive whole. He saw a glass of water, clear and calm, and the 9 passed through. Water remained H2O, but it ceased to be a glass of water. The molecules stayed as molecules, but they no longer composed a single ordered entity. The mandrake's decomposition returned formed things to an unorganized, primitive state. It negated the concept of the whole. When Regulus opened his eyes, it was dark outside. He looked at his palm and saw nothing, but he knew the droplet he had felt had left a mark on his consciousness. On the 3rd day, he attempted extraction. Progress was slow. One mature mandrake contained more 9 than he had expected, and its resistance was proportionally greater. At midday, he finally drew a condensed ball of 9, about the size of 2 teardrops from the first plant. That evening, the second plant gave him 3 drops. Late into the night, he managed to take from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th plants. Agnes came 3 times a day, morning with hot tea and toast, noon with a simple meal, and night with soup. She never asked about his progress and never pressed him. Each time she entered, she moved lightly, placed the food on the table by the door, and retreated quietly, closing the door behind her. The work was slow and exacting, but at last there were results. The next chapter is even more exciting. Chapter 158, Practicing Magic Costs Money. We look forward to your visit.